those as written tests, essay questions. So you can expect that there might be some, but at the moment I'm writing most of it as a multiple choice quiz. So that's kind of where I'm going at the moment, is a multiple choice quiz with maybe a few essay questions tacked on at the end, and that, yeah, there'll be a time limit on that. I'm not sure what the time limit will be. Let's just say the time limit on that is, I'll just put that a note here because I need to update that. Let's just say the time limit that's going to be an hour, and then you'll have the remaining time there. One of the things I haven't, with the hands-on portion, I've done it 2 different ways, and it kind of depends on what scale of the project is. And so if it's a small thing that I figure you guys can fit in the time allotted, this will be due 4:35. If I figure that you can get it done in class time, then it'll be doing on 4:35. If I kind of look at it and determine that this is something I need to get you to take home, it will be due that night. Okay, so it'll be one of those 2 options. I still got to sort out some of the details. Okay, so I can't give you all the nitty-gritty of that yet because I have to work through and figure out what I'm doing there. Part of that is because, like, I do have tests from last year, but I'm changed so much that I can't really reuse my tests from last year. Okay. So does that help a little bit? So yeah, just plan on there being a deadline for those, obviously. It's just I don't know all of that yet. So, but I think I can commit to an hour on the theory portion. Okay. I need to do attendance. So let's do that over here. So Michael, Evan, Chase, and Parker, Brandon, Don, Michael, Cody, David, Aaron, Danny, Adrian, and Josh. Okay. So kind of agenda for today I posted up here. We've got a lecture plan today. Your lab for this week is going to be 302. We'll kind of hopefully talk about that today or tomorrow, depending on how long you're going to stay. There is a fair amount of stuff to cover today, just over a few different topics. And we're going to be doing some coding along, and hopefully that will help you get started with the 302. But we want to make sure that I get through all that before I set you loose on the labs, because there's a few things you need to know before you get started. Homework-wise, you should be finishing up the Express reading material if you haven't yet. I've also posted a video, it's about 25 minutes long, related to Postman that's up there as well. It's not a graded assignment, but it will help you kind of find out about some of that Postman stuff. Postman wasn't in the original reading assignment, and it's kind of a separate tool, and we'll go through a demo of that today, because it's something you really need to understand and know how to use in order to test the code you're going to be able to write. Okay, so that's kind of where that fits in, is we're going to use it to test our code. So if you want to follow along with where we're at, I just posted this. I did post this link in Discord, so you can get kind of my outline for today. Kind of like I did with Node. I'm not going to go through doing slides. I'm just going to kind of take, hey, here's my outline, and try to do this a little bit more informal. That way we can spend more time actually working in VS Code and doing some examples with it. Problem with doing slides is it's much harder for me to spend more hands-on time there. So let's talk about where we're kind of going. So where we're going this week is, we started last week, we started talking about Node, we started to talk about JavaScript, we did a big review on some of those concepts and some of the new features in JavaScript. So
What we didn't do though yet is we didn't start making web applications, which is what we want to do, right? Our whole goal this semester is at the end of the day, we want to make web applications, okay? So that's what we're starting. That's what we're starting on this week, is how do we build web applications using Node? And we're going to be adding in another tool called Express, which that's part of what your reading assignment was this weekend and as well as today. So is about this tool called Express, this library. Now, in order for us to kind of get into there, I do need to talk a little bit about something called NPM. Namely, NPM stands for Node Package Manager, or at least it historically stands for Node Package Manager. Today, it doesn't really stand for anything. It's just the letters NPM, just so you know. So it used to stand for Node Package Manager. Today, it's just those three letters, okay? So NPM is important because it's how we're going to get code written by other developers, okay? Because there's a lot of tools and a lot of things that are available that you can build on top of Node. You can say, hey, I'm going to maybe build a web application with just Node, just vanilla JavaScript, Node, nothing on top of it. And you can do that, but it isn't really practical once your application starts to get bigger and bigger, and once you want things to start to be kind of repeatable, right? So you can borrow code and reuse it in different places. So we need to pull in some code that other people have written rather than writing all the code ourselves. And so that's where NPM comes in. So NPM, if you want to take a note of this, is made up of three parts. There is a website. There is the registry, which is kind of like the database, as well as there is the client for NPM. So there is the website, the registry, and the client. Okay. So the website you can find, just go into Google, type in NPM, and you'll find this website, npmjs.com. Okay? Definitely bookmark this place. You'll be visiting this a lot this semester. Okay? So npmjs.com, there's a lot of stuff here that you'll will be referring back to throughout the semester. So this website is kind of the central view into everything that exists in NPM, all the packages that are written, right? So packages are basically bundles of code that other developers have written and they've published and made available. Every package has a name, every package has a version number, okay? And so as we're working with these, we say, well, what's the name of the version, and what's the name of the package, and that's the part you have to remember. You also have to see, hey, there's versions, and continuously these things are being updated and changes are being made, and that's other thing we have to kind of track. So let's start by going into the search bar. So if I go into the search bar on npm.js and maybe type in .env, D-O-T-E-N-V, it's going to give me some suggestions. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Okay, you'll see the top result is one that's an exact match. And so if I go to this is the main page for the .env package. Okay, so if you want to know how this package works, you can go here and you can look at it. The README file is like right there. And generally speaking, this file will give you everything you need to know about how to install it, how to use it, etc. So this is a really good thing to refer to in terms of finding that official documentation for the packages that we'll be using. Okay. Some cases where it's larger, it may be a link to a completely separate website. That's the case with Express. Express, there's a lot more to know about. A few things you can pay attention to. This first page is the README. So you remember kind of when we created those files, we created a readme.md file when we created the GitHub repo. That's what this is. Right? If I was going to look in the README, if I was going to look at the repo, this whole documentation here is in that readme.md for this package. A few other things we can see and worth noting. It'll show you dependencies. So a lot of packages in here depend on other packages. So maybe let me go over to Express, because Express has a few dependencies. So Express here has 30 dependencies. dependencies means that this package requires these other things to be installed, or it's based on those other things before you can actually use it. The good news with these dependencies is they'll automatically be installed for you. I just have to install Express, and all of these other things will get installed. Cool? Cool. And also make sure it gets versions that are compatible with that. But that's a very good thing to know, especially from a security standpoint. Well, this package, Express, is depending on these 30 other packages. If any of these 30 packages get compromised, well, then potentially your code is compromised. Or these can have changes which then break Express, right? So one of the things I do generally look for, I actually still tend to look for packages that have 0 or few dependencies, few things that they depend on from a security standpoint as well as just from a file size sort of standpoint. Cool? And this is kind of a relic mostly of how they built Express. In fact, a lot of these packages are actually maintained by the Express team themselves in some way, shape, or form, or only part of Express. So it's a little bit deceiving how many packages are there, because a lot of those are not necessarily separate packages. They could have been included. Other things you'll see, this is going the other way. You can see how many things depend on it. So that's the number of other packages that people have built that in turn depend on Express. Things that people have built on top of Express. Does that make sense? So there's a whole bunch of people that have written code that depends on Express, and their packages would break. And you can also see kind of a list of all the histories they've had, all the versions they've uploaded. So they've uploaded a total of 264 different versions to here. Okay, so you can see some of that, and those are oftentimes kind of indications of the health of the package, as well as how how popular is it, how healthy it is, how well maintained is it, etc. So a lot of these things you kind of look as flags. You're like, with Node, there's every time you pull in a package, there's always at least 3 options, kind of thing. There's always multiple options that do the same thing. So there is a process of kind of evaluating and figuring out, do I use A, B, C, or D? And some of that comes into just, is it being maintained? Is the project being actively maintained or actively used? So we can see over here there's a link to the repository. This will take you to their GitHub page, which includes their code. You can also see any open issues, right? So if there's a bug with this package, I can go there and look at it. I can go read up on bugs, or I can even file a bug. If I find a bug with any package on Npm, basically go to their GitHub and file an issue. I've done that with a few packages. Or I've even submitted, in some cases, what we call pull requests, is to submit code changes to the package. They've also got a homepage you can see here. They've got expressjs.com is their main documentation thing. If we look at downloads, you can kind of see, hey, well, an awful lot of people are doing that. We're looking at 17 million downloads right now, right, on the regular. So that tells you that project's being used by a lot of things. You see the latest version is 4.17.1. License is MIT. How big it is. It's 16 files total. Right now there's 112 issues open. Okay, those are good numbers to pay attention to. That's not a healthy number, by the way, just so we're clear. That's not a healthy number. Pull requests, these are how many people have kind of suggested changes to be made to this package. So there's 60 open, unapproved requests for change, basically, is what that's saying. So there's a lot of stuff there. Their last publish is a year ago, so there's been some issues. And the last time they published has been about 2 years ago. So Express is a great thing. There's 2 things that have kind of happened with it. It's kind of hit a point where it's mostly there, mostly working. So it's part of why it's not seeing as many updates, because a lot of the bugs have been worked out. But there's also just been some blockades with this one in particular. Right. Now, if we go back to look at .env, that may be a little bit of a different story. So we can kind of see this one. They're on version 10. Well, they still published one 4 months ago, so we can kind of see the health.
You can see 20 million people probably using it. You can see kind of the size of it.
We can see, hey, there's 12 files in this thing. There's 20 open issues, 7 open pull requests, etc. So there's a lot of information that I look there, just to kind of see how healthy is this project. Does that make sense? If some of those things start going the wrong direction, then what are my options? Well, usually it's fine. It's a stable package. It's been in use for several years. It's fine. I'm just going to keep working with it. Sometimes it's a case of like, well, okay, maybe these are signals that the project's not being maintained anymore or not actively being contributed to. So maybe I need to either choose another option or make my own version. Choose another option or make my own version. So that's happened with a few of these packages. Sometimes they've been forked in different versions there. But those are good things to pay attention to, in terms of the health of what you're bringing in from NPM. All cool? Just recognize this is code written by other people, and you're depending on it. Cool? It's not a bad thing. I mean, it's kind of a necessary evil for us to be depending on other code. It's a good way to get move forward, but those are things you have to pay attention to. So coming back to the main sort of area, where I generally look, once I've kind of decided that I am going to use that package, and this may part of be in that decision too, you'll see that usually they have sections like this, an install and a usage section, right? So install says, hey, if I want to use .env, the command I need to run is npm install.env. Everybody see that? If I want to use it, it's like, okay, it says, as early as possible in the application, you want to put this code here, right? Now, what does it do? So just looking up here, it says .env is a zero dependency module, loads environment variables, etc. So you can kind of read those pieces and kind of get a gist of what all those parts are, okay? So what we've been looking at here is the website, right? This is the NPM website, and it's a very useful place to look and find information. I also mentioned that there's some other parts, right? So NPM also is a registry. Basically what this registry is, it's the giant database of all the packages that appear on this website. So there's a giant database that maintains all of these versions and all of these dependencies, and all the data that you actually see here is actually contained in the registry, right? So this is just like a front end for that registry. It's not the actual database, okay? Now, we have to interface with that database, right? So one way we can do that is we can look at the website. The other way that we can interface with it is using the Npm Client, okay? Now, the Npm Client is a command line tool that we use to basically install things or view things from the NPM registry. Cool? So we're going to start over here on the website, kind of find the documentation about the package, and then we want to go install it. Okay. So what I want to do, I'm going to walk through kind of what some of these different commands are that we can use. I'm going to toss this on another screen. So what I want to do is I'm going to create a new folder on my desktop, and if you would go ahead and code along with this. So we're going to go hello world -express. Hello world -express. Should be a brand new folder. Okay. So if I open this up, there's not going to be anything there. I'm going to go ahead and open the folder in code. Okay, so I've got Hello World Express open now. I'm going to go ahead and toss my screen share on. So I've got this open. I want to start, maybe running some of these commands and trying to install some things from NPM. So for instance, let's say, we know about this .env package. Maybe I want to go install it. So I might say npm space install .env. because that's basically the documentation I saw on the website, right? Website says, well, you want to install this, run this command, run npm install.env. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and enter on that. It's going to process a little bit. Now, one of the things it did, and historically this threw an error, but notice it kind of created this package.json file. Okay, so that package.json file is where we track a lot of things for our packages, including it's where we track what things that we depend on, right? So if we install a package, it's going to modify package.json to track those things that we've installed. So it says we've installed .env and we want version 10. Clear so far? Install .env and we want 10. Here. The little caret there basically says 10 or up. 10 or up. It says we won't install 11, but we'll install anything, with the second digit and the third digit going up. In terms of version numbers, all the packages on the NPM follow something called semantic versioning. Okay, semantic versioning, which has 3 parts. The first number is our major version. The second one is the minor, and the third one is the patch. Okay, major, minor, patch. Okay. So major is the one you update anytime you're making major changes, right? If you're making major changes to your package, that goes up. Namely, if you're going to make breaking changes, which would break code that's already using the package, then you're supposed to increment the major version. Cool? If you're making changes to, say, add new features, but you're not breaking existing code, we would call that a minor. We would call that a minor patch. So if I add things to this but don't break anything that's existing, this might go up to like 10.1, right? That would be if I'm adding features or things like that. If I'm just doing bug fixes purely, not adding new features, just fixing bugs, that's where we'll see incrementing the last number. So that last number for patches is strictly for bug fixes. Does that make sense? So in theory, everything except minor changes, and everything except major version, just changes in the minor and the patch should indicate non-breaking changes. I should be able to just cleanly take an update there, and it shouldn't break things. All that assumes that the developers maintaining the packagers are sufficiently talented and wary, because there's nothing that enforces that has to be the case. It could be that the package owner releases 10.0.0.0, and then they release 10.0.1 and break everybody's code. Like, there's actually no guardrails necessarily on that. You are relying on the people maintaining the package to enforce that. Okay? Clear there? That's kind of some of those things you have to know. So I'm going to stay here. I'm at 10.0 because that's the latest thing that is available. So I'm saying I want 10.0. Another file that you'll see in here, when you install packages and uninstall them, etc., it will create and modify this package lock.json file. Okay? This file is really, really important, but you should never touch it with your editor, period. You should never do any sort of manually editing on this file. This file is only meant to be edited by automated tools. Okay? Is that clear? Don't touch package lock.json. But what I do need you to do, anytime package lock.json changes, you do need to upload that to Git. I do need that version. Basically what this tracks is the versions that were actually installed and the versions of the dependencies that were actually installed. So there's a lot of important stuff that this does track in order to be able to reproduce the package that you have, but it's not a file that we edit directly. Is that clear? It's not a file you edit directly, but you do need to upload to Git. Another thing you'll notice when I install the package, you'll see that there's a Node Modules folder now. So Node Modules is where everything that you install goes. If I install a package, it's going to get put into Node into Node Modules, including all dependencies of what I installed, right? So in this case, there's just one .env folder because .env has no dependencies. Okay, is that clear? So if I want to see what's installed there and kind of look at the code that was downloaded, I can kind of dig around and look in the .env folder and see the code that they've supplied. Generally speaking, I don't do too much digging into the node modules folder itself. Okay? And usually it's easier to look at the documentation than to look at the file structure and all the things that how they built this system. Cool? Okay. The important thing with node modules is we don't want to upload it because node modules gets very large. So rather than uploading node modules to Git, the pattern is that you put things in the package.json, right? So package.json says, hey, I need 10.10.00, right? And so the next person who picks it up, whether it's another developer, whether it's you on another machine, whether it's when you want to host this on Heroku, it will look at this and go install those things, right? So just to prove that that's the case, let's delete node modules completely. Okay, so if I delete it completely, it's gone. I can then go install all my dependencies using a simple command. So if I do npm install without a packaging, just npm install, that's going to install all of the things that were listed as dependencies. Does that make sense? So if I do npm install, it will restore that. So because it's so easy to restore, we don't upload those things to Git. Does that make sense? So we do need to upload the package.json and package lock.json, but we don't upload node modules. Okay. If you've got this simply set like this and you start pushing things to Git, it's going to push all of that, right? So what we use, there's a file in Git called the Git Ignore file. It's .git ignore, no actual file name, just a file extension. That is a file that tells Git that I don't want to upload those files. I don't want to upload certain files. Okay, it's really just a text file. So for instance, I could show you what this is going to look like if I make a new file and git ignore. I create that with that specific name. You can put the things in there that you want to ignore. Now, the one I've asked you to pull from GitHub to pre-select the node template has a lot of stuff in there. If you look in there, there's several hundreds of lines of stuff in there. What matters though is that in terms of ignoring node modules is that it has a file that literally says, it has a line that says node modules, right? So basically that one line is what ignores this. So it says ignore any folder named node modules anywhere in your repository. Okay, it says don't upload it. One thing that's worth noting with the git ignore, if you've already uploaded node modules or you already uploaded something that you've ignored, this doesn't get rid of it. It doesn't get rid of it by changing the git ignore. You actually have to completely remove it from the repo and then push the updated version. Does that make sense? You actually have to remove it to get it ignored again. Okay, so you're going to see that. You'll oftentimes see things like this, .exe, star.dll, etc. So this would say ignore anything with the DLL extension, ignore anything with the exe extension, and ignore any folder named node modules. Good so far? Does that kind of make sense? The git ignore file is actually really, really simple. It's just telling you what files you don't want to upload to Git. But it's super, super important for it to be there. Okay? All right. So one of the things I generally don't want to do, when I started saying npm.env, this went ahead and created the package.json for me. Did everybody see that? I generally want to initialize and create it myself before I start installing packages. Okay, so I'm going to actually delete several of these files. So I'm going to delete my package lock, package.json, my node modules, all of that's gone, right? So I'm only left with my git ignore file. So what I want to do before I start working with packages, before I start pulling things down, I want to make sure that that file is set up. Okay, so to set that file up, I'm going to go npm init, npm init is the way we initialize the manifest, as we would say. The package.json is basically our manifest for what's in the project. Okay. It's worth noting that you have to pay attention to where that folder is. So it's going to create it in Hello World Express because that's where I was when I ran the npm init command. Okay. So I'm going to go in here. It's going to ask me a few things, namely what do I want to have the package name, etc. Anytime you see something in parentheses, that means that's the default value. So we're going to say, yep, I want that value. Default version is 1. I might say description. This is an example. Doesn't really matter so much what I say there. In terms of the entry point from here on out, it's always going to be server.js. From here on out, it's always going to be server.js as your entry point. So server.js is where we're going to put the main code for our server. Okay. Test command, you can leave blank. Git repository, it will pre-fill if you're already in a Git repo. Keywords, blank. Author, Paul Smith. License is MIT. It's going to say, is this okay? I'm going to hit enter for yes. Okay. So now that I've run through there, it'll done maybe a better job of initializing and setting this up. Okay. So this is what you should be starting with in your package.json. All clear? It's worth noting that everything in the package.json is optional, right? Including if I were to remove everything here and just have a pair of curly braces, that is a valid package.json file. This is valid. It's allowed, right? Everything in here is optional, just so we're clear. But we generally want to have all that sort of metadata in there for future purposes. Cool? So first thing we do when we create a new repo is we're going to run npm init to get it started up. Okay? Once we've run npm init, that's where we're going to start adding packages. Okay? So in here, let's go back and try to add that package again. So if I do npm install .env and hit enter on that, you're going to see it adds it to that package, right? So we're going to see, hey, there's a dependencies section now, right? So we've got our metadata. We also have our list of dependencies, right? If I want to install more dependencies, so let's say I want to maybe install config. So let's say npm install config. So now I have .env and config in there, right? Which with whatever their latest versions are. So there it's 10 and 3.3.6, right? So that's a starting point. So here we're kind of using this is the client for npm. It's how you actually install things. Any questions so far? Now, what happens if I fat finger something and I maybe change my mind and I decide I want to uninstall a package, right? This happens, right? Sometimes I accidentally install a package that I don't want to be there. I go back to the console. I'm going to type in npm uninstall, and we're going to uninstall config. Config's back out of there. So if you ever need to add and subtract packages, you're going to do it through here. Okay, that's the preference. If you need to add and subtract things, we're generally going to do that through the console. All good? Okay, what else do we need to do in here?
Mr. Smith, can you increase your font size and make this again?
Yes, I can.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Close that. So if we're looking at here, what's the next thing on my list? So on my list, so we talked about init, we talked about a little bit about install. So there's the uninstall command to remove things. And those are things you want to pay attention, definitely take a note of. So the 3 commands that we've covered so far is npm init, npm install, and npm uninstall. You actually do most of the work just knowing those 3 commands. There are a lot more commands in npm, but if you just know those 3, you can get most of things, most of your work done. There are some additional flags, though, that we can use to install certain packages. So namely, we can install some packages in the global scope, and we can also install some packages as dev dependencies. Okay, so we might want to ask, why would I want to do that? So most of the code that you install, you'll just install like we did, just npm install.end, npm install.config, no flags. That's the regular stuff that's part of your application, right? If it's going to be part of the application that you're delivering, then you want to do it that way. Now, there are other things that you're, say, maybe using to build the code but are not part of the application itself. So for instance, maybe you're using some command line tools to do different things, or you're using some what we would call development tools, development dependencies. Okay, so these things are used to build the application, but not used to actually run the application. Does that make sense? They're not used at runtime, but they might be used at build time. So some things that fit into there, and the first and most important one I would talk about is there's one called Nodemon. So if we go to the website and look for Nodemon, short for Node Monitor, Nodemon is a way to kind of put a monitor on your application, and what it does is every time you change the code, it restarts the application for you, which is really, really helpful. You just make a code change, restarts the server, running your new code. That means you don't have to do a lot of like save file, close, restart, save file, close, restart. We can just constantly be making changes, and it will automatically restart our server every time we make a code change. Cool. It's great for development. It's not something we use when we are actually shipping the website live. Does that make sense? So when we're shipping this website live, we're going to run Node. When we're testing it locally, we're going to test it using Nodemon instead of Node. Make sense? We'll kind of see how that fits in today. So Nodemon is an interesting sort of thing. Now notice what the command for installing it is. npm install lowercase g Nodemon. That lowercase g is special. That lowercase g stands for global. It's worth noting all these flags are case sensitive. It doesn't matter if it's a lowercase or an uppercase letter. And in some cases it does something different. So in here it has to be a lowercase letter. So -g says that we're going to install this globally on your machine. Okay. Anything that you install globally doesn't get added as a dependency. It's not listed anywhere in your package.json file. Is everybody with me there? Anything you install globally won't be listed in your package.json as a dependency. The other thing is it's not installed in the Node modules folder that's within our project. It's actually installed somewhere else on your computer. Does that make sense? So it's installed somewhere else on our computer. One of the benefits of doing that is now I can use Nodemon anywhere. Okay, I can now use it in any folder on my computer. I can now run Nodemon and it'll work. I don't have to reinstall it. The downside is now we don't know what version of Nodemon we're using, right? So this is something that we use for a small set of tools, and you'll see it specifically in the install instructions, which ones you need to install globally. Most packages will not be installed globally, just so we're clear. Okay, most packages will not be installed globally. In fact, there's a new way to run any global packages like this using something called npx, which is kind of the norm now. Rather than installing anything globally, we usually run things through npx. Okay, but it's still convenient and still fast to do this one, particularly globally. All good. Part of why we do this is we don't really care. We don't need a copy of Nodemon for every project we're working on, and we also basically don't care what version of Nodemon we're running because it's not really part of our package, part of our released product, etc. So I'm going to go back to VS Code. We're going to get this installed. So npm dash install dash G. Remember, that's a lowercase g. And I'm going to type in Nodemon. That should all go through good, successful, and that will now mean that you can use this for the rest of the semester. Right? You should not need to reinstall Nodemon. There's probably not going to be a new version. So, how can I use Nodemon? Let me show you real quick. You'll notice our dependencies haven't changed, right? Because we install it globally. That's what we want. If I try to run it now, let's say I need a little file here. I'm going to call this maybe, let's call this server.js. So this is server.js. So in server.js, I'm going to type in, just for starters, console log hello world. And maybe I'll add in here new date, just so it shows the current date and time, and we can verify that things are actually working. Okay. Maybe a space there. Hello world, new date. So now I'm going to run. Normally I would run this with node server.js, right? And if I do that, okay, it runs, and then it's going to kind of finish. Oh, I do need that. Yeah. So you see it's going to run once. I can run it again, calling node, etc., etc., etc. So what I want to do is run this through Nodemon so I can make changes and have it just automatically rerun the program. So I'm going to say Nodemon server.js. Okay. So it's ran. You see there's a little bit more when I'm running this on Nodemon. It says, okay, Nodemon started up. We got Nodemon version 2012. 2012. To restart at any time, we can do blah, blah, blah. It's watching any files with the extension JS, MJS, or JSON. If a file with that extension changes, it'll restart the program. If it's a file that doesn't have that extension, it won't restart it. Does that make sense? So for instance, if you had HTML files and you wanted to restart on those, it's not currently doing it. Okay. So, how is this different? Let's say I make a change here. Save it. Save the file. There it goes. It's restarting the server, and it just runs the new script.
I had somewhere there, I'm not sure what went wrong.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So that we can fix. Let's see who else has that in. So you may be seeing an issue related to PowerShell. Try to run the thing that we're doing. Okay, so that ran. Well, no, you still need to try and write, catch up with where we're at, server.js, and move on. You got that here? Yes. So NPM. Yes. It actually doesn't matter when you're installing Debian. Very well. So, but it's dash G. So that's fine. So that's going to install it normally itself. So you've got some access to the objective. Or look at that. I've got. They got the same error on Windows, but it's going to be good. I don't really get that close. So you can investigate it.
But you better have reach right. You have reach.
Yeah, if you click go to
You're waiting. You apply. Yeah, it's like, right.
Yeah. Yep.
That's fine.
You're going successful. And your problem is that you need to have this stuff not inside of those groups. So if you're creating a module folder here, you don't want to do that. So don't create projects. So package.json, you need to, previously we installed .env, you need to still do that, install .env locally, and install Nodemon. Okay, so a few of you are getting errors related to PowerShell. I'm not getting those here because I've already fixed it. What I need somebody to do, maybe Evan, you can do this, copy the error and toss it in Discord, if you can. It's not a hard thing to fix. It's just something you have to fix once. There we go. So if you're seeing something like this that says Nodemon PS1 can't be run, etc., that's because this is running through PowerShell, and PowerShell has some restrictions about running code that's written by other people, by third-party code. So in order to be able to run Nodemon and a few other packages, this is not the only one where this occurs, in order to be able to run these tools, we need to open up the access a little bit on PowerShell, which is not too hard. In fact, there's a link here. You'll see there's a link embedded to it, points to an article on Microsoft. I'm going to take that and I'm going to copy that over. This is part of why I wanted the error code. Okay, that's going to point you to this page here. It says about execution policies. So long story short, there's a set of rules that your system has about what PowerShell can do. It can be set either at a machine-wide level. It can also be set on a per-user level. And what we're going to do is we're going to change it on a machine-wide level, so this will be good for everywhere. There's a few different levels there: all signed, bypass, default, remote signed, etc., restricted, undefined, unrestricted. So what we're going to change the policy to is this one called remote signed. And that says that any script that's come from the internet, it can be run as long as it's been signed, okay? Which it turns out most of the tools on NPM have already been signed, so that'll work. So we just need to get it there. Level here, they've got user policy, current user, local machine. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to run this command here, get execution policy list, and copy that and run that in here. Now my result is going to be a little bit different perhaps than yours. So for me, when I run get execution policy .-list, it's saying here's the scope, here's the execution policy. So for most of my scopes, I don't actually have it configured, but for my current user, the user I'm logged in, it's set to remote signed. At the local machine level, it's set to restricted. Right? So if you run this command, that will show you what levels you have. Evan, what levels do you have for those?
Mine are all undefined.
They're all undefined. So that's why. Right? So what we need to do is at least change current user to remote signed. Then it will work. Or we can change them all to remote signed. That'll work. As long as this one, the current user is remote signed, that'll fix it.
Current user, does that mean I had logged out, logged back in, it's no longer...
No, it means your user account. So if you had multiple user accounts on the machine, they would have different execution policies. So if I had 2 users on this machine, I would need to potentially set that multiple times. So in order to change it, so get execution policy tells us what it currently is. Set execution policy changes what it is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say set execution policy, and we're going to set it to remote sign. So I'm going to paste that in here. Okay, so I said set dash execution policy space dash execution policy remote signed. So this is the command that I ran. Everybody see that? Okay. Now I did get an error, right? I did get an error. It says this is defined to change the execution policy, right? So because here I'm trying to change it on the whole system, I didn't scope it, I didn't say just to change it for the current user, it's telling me that I have to run this as administrator, right? So when we're running PowerShell here within VS Code, it's not running it as administrator. Cool. So in order to actually fix this, I need to open up a separate window and do this. Okay. So I'm going to go to my start menu. Just going to click there and start typing in PowerShell. Okay. So you should all see something like this come up, assuming you're on a Windows machine. So up here, you say Windows PowerShell. You see there's some options over on the left. So if you see the option Run as Administrator. Okay. So we're going to do that, or Run as Administrator. Fearful warning, this is an administrator console. It can literally do anything to your system. Don't fat finger things when you've got this open, because it can literally do anything. Yeah. So what I'm going to do, yeah, and you'll also notice that it's currently in Windows System 32. Another good way to get into trouble. So specifically write in that command as is. Set execution policy dash execution policy remote signed. You're going to run that. That should change them all to remote signed and fix your issue.
I ran this code here. I got the saw was remote signed and scoped the current user last year, and it worked in it worked in here.
Yeah, that one should work in there. And I think that's why I have one just set that one. But that's how you yeah. I'm going to go ahead and enter on that so I can show you what that looks like. So you're going to get an ask a question here because we're changing the policy across everything. There's a few questions as far as how do you want to accept this. You'll see it's yellow. It's defaulting to no. If I use little arrow keys, I believe I can go, oh no, I can't use the arrow keys. But I can enter uppercase A, or just, where is it? Should be able to just enter. Oh, keyboard is not responding. Try run that again. A. Yeah, there it goes. It's off the screen, but all I typed in was A and enter to say yes. Yes. Otherwise, it asks me. Still goes go. No, just press A once. And then hit enter. Okay. So you didn't run this as an administrator. You just ran this as a regular. And you close that. And run it as an administrator. So I can PowerShell. So yeah, so that's in the right track. You'll want to do something slightly different. Okay. Yeah, so sudo says do this as the super user to chown is change ownership. And then I think -r, I think that's read. You're saying the user can read. All right, we just need write access to that too. So you're giving access to that.
So you should be able to run Nodemon server request.
I never had it.
So everybody's run that. You should be able to go back to yes. So assuming we've done this, we've given it execution permissions. You should be able to come back to VS Code and do what we originally wanted to do, which was Nodemon space server.js. So that's what you should be able to do now. Is anybody getting errors still? So you can knock error from Nodemon.
Whoa.
You never save your box.
I just made it change the file from my screen, saved it, and it instantly ran everything.
Oh, yeah.
That's nuts.
You just gotta restart.
That's nuts.
Love it. Okay. So you have to install Nodemon, don't you? Npm install. Yes. So you install that. Okay, good. Does that kind of make sense? So basically the idea of Nodemon is this is a totally optional tool, but it will really, really make your development much, much faster, especially as your servers get more complex, because you just make a change, application restart, right? So it takes a lot of button presses out of your regular workflow just to have that tool. It's one of those tools that we could have talked about last week, but I think there was some value to you kind of seeing what the processes of stopping and starting it is, because there are still cases where you need to stop the server completely manually and restart it, especially if I need to install more packages. I'm actually going to have to stop the server, install the packages, and then I can restart the server. So there are still times where you do have to shut Nodemon down, do the Control-C thing to get back. But that's the general gist, right? So the general gist is we can use this tool to restart our servers. Really, really helpful little tool, okay? That's basically all you have to know. In order to run your server, instead of doing node.server.js, you do Nodemon server.js. It's the only difference. There's nothing more to know about Nodemon. Okay. The next question is what about development dependencies? So namely where this comes in is things like linters. Linters is kind of the first part that you see. It's like, well, that's one of the things that we would consider a development dependency. We're going to use a linter to help give us suggestions on writing better code. Okay, so that's where a linter fits in. It helps gives you suggestions for writing better code. It's not part of actually building the application and actually running the application, so that's why it would be considered a development dependency. Okay, so if I want to install something like ESLint, which is a linter for JavaScript, or ECMA script as it's also known, I would say npm install -d with an uppercase.
Okay. I see I put it in Nodemon, right?
Huh? Yeah, I exited Nodemon. Yeah, so I exited Nodemon with Control-C. So I'm going to npm install -d with an uppercase letter, uppercase D for development. It's also worth noting there is a long form to all of these commands. So for instance, the -g and the -b are shorthands. The longhand version would be -- global or -- save -dev.
Those are the long form version of these two. It's quick enough to do this. I always do the shortcuts, just so you know. But there is a longer one
if you want to use that one instead. So -d, and I'm going to do ESLint. The difference here is that with that -d, it goes into dev dependencies instead of dependencies. That's the difference. Dev dependencies instead of dependencies.
So what's the difference between a global, this dependency, and a dev dependency?
So global, remember, is installed into your machine, not into the project. Okay, so we only use global for command line tools. Okay, for things like Nodemon, I want it to now be a command I can use from the terminal. That's the only thing we're going to install globally. These things here, dependencies are part of our project. Remember, that's going to be the most common case. The most common case is you just install it as a regular dependency. The rare case is going to be as a development dependency. I'll tell you what these are, right? If I want you to install these, I will tell you that this needs to be a development dependency. This, again, is not part of the actual program. In order for the web application to work, it doesn't need ESLint. But if I'm a developer working on this website, on this project, I'm saying I want to install that. Okay. Cool. So it's recalling, it's remembering what version we do have installed, but it's kind of separate, if that makes sense. Webpack is another one of those. Babel is another one of those. All your linters fit in there. But the main things that are going to end up here are going to be Webpack and Babel sort of things when we get to, if we were to get to and talk about those things. Okay. So one thing to note, remember that all of these packages, right, have some documentation. So let's say we look at the documentation for the one we just installed, ESLint. Okay. So the documentation for this one dictates some stuff about install. And so it does say, hey, npm install it as say dev, right? So I did the shortcut -d, same thing. So we're installing as a development dependencies. There's also a next step, right? So kind of like how we have an npm init, there's an ESLint in it. So this gives us a wizard to set up ESLint. If you just install it, nothing happens. You don't get any of the benefit of ESLint if that's all you do. You have to actually run this step to set up the configuration for it. Is that clear? So for these linters, that's one thing we have to do. Okay, I'm going to try and run this one command here. So node modules, ESLint init. I'm going to take that, run that here. So when I hit enter on that, I'm going to go start running this. So you can see there's a little wizard that's popped up for me. It's asking me, how would you like to use ESLint? Okay, and that's basically saying how strict do you want it to be? Do you want it to just check for syntax errors? Do you want to check it for syntax errors and problems? Or do you also want to go syntax errors, find problems, and enforce code styles? The further down the list you go here, so if I go in here and use my up and down arrows, if I pick that third option, it's going to be really, really restrictive. Right? It's going to be really restrictive on how you write your code. If you go up here, it's going to be very loose. It's not going to give you very many errors. At the bottom, it will give you a lot more errors. Right? So let's just say for our purposes, let's go in the middle, and we're going to say only for syntax and problems. So I'm going to hit enter on that middle one. The next thing it's going to ask us is what type of modules are you using in your project? Okay. It's worth noting in JavaScript there's more than one way to do modules. Okay. So historically with Node we've done this common JS pathway with the keywords require and the keywords exports, and we're still doing that this semester. There is a newer way in JavaScript that uses import and export, which it was kind of what we call ES modules. So you got common JS modules and ES modules. So the way we're writing our code is using require, and that'll be common JS modules. So that's what I'm going to set up here, is I'm going to pick common JS modules. Enter. It's asking what framework are we using, namely are we using React or are we using Vue? Right now we're using neither one of those, so we could just say none of the above. You know, maybe eventually though we're going to want to use some React, right? I might choose React there. But I'm going to just go ahead and say none of these. It's going to ask, are we using TypeScript or not? So TypeScript's kind of a built on top of, you know, language built on top of JavaScript that basically is almost JavaScript with types. That's not something we're covering here, not something we're doing right now, so we're going to hit no. Next up, this is a weird question. It's asking, are we running it in the browser or Node or both? Okay. Unlike some of the previous questions, this one behaves a little bit different. So you can use the up and down arrow to move things. You'll notice that there's a checkbox next to browser and a checkbox next to Node. So you can choose individually which ones you want there. Now, don't press enter. If you press enter, you're going to have to redo this whole thing and start from the beginning. You'll notice in here you can press spacebar to select. So don't press enter, press spacebar. So I'm going to hit spacebar on browser because this is not for browser right now. And I'm just going to code check Node. So I'm going to just say, hey, I'm just having Node code here. Hit enter. Okay. It's going to ask what format you want the configuration for ESLint to be in. It can be in JavaScript, it can be YAML, it can be JSON. Any of these work really. I would recommend starting with the JSON config. Personally, I prefer the YAML config over the other two, but it's definitely easier to learn this using the JSON. It's definitely most supported with the JSON configuration. All right, so now that we've run that command, what you'll see is that there's a new file in your project called eslint.rc.json. So this is what the wizard generated. Where's my terminal? So the wizard just generated this file. So we've got an environment that includes common.js, it includes ECMA script 2021. So that means that you can use all the modern, even the latest JavaScript features. We're using Node. We're not using the browser. The base configuration that we're basing on is ESLint recommended. It's actually that came out of the first option that we picked of how strict do we want this to be. So we started with ESLint recommended. So that's going to start by configuring some of the rules about what should it warn you about, what should give you errors about, and those kind of things. Parser options that's also saying, hey, this is HTML version 12. So again, latest version of JavaScript, and then some additional configuration for the rules, right? So if you want to change how the rules specifically work, that's how you set it up, okay? If you're setting up a linter, all of those linters are going to have a wizard like this, just so we're clear. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to set up a linter for JavaScript, we want to set up a linter for CSS, and we're also going to want to set up a linter for HTML. Okay, so we're going to have 3 of these that we want to go through for most of our projects so that it can kind of configure those things. Okay, cool. It is worth noting, this file is basically where you can generally drop and copy and paste it. So I can generally take this ESLint.rc JSON file and pull it into another project and not have to run through the wizard again. I usually find myself doing that, reusing these configurations. So I kind of get it to where I want it, and then I might reuse the configuration for several processes. All that generated was just that one JSON file. Cool? So it's not too hard to get back to the same configuration in another project. So that's kind of, you know, we did regular dependencies, we did a global dependency, and then we have a development dependency. Cool? Are you tracking with me there? Okay. So what were the flags that you needed to use? So regular installs, no flags. What was the flag for global install?
Dash G,
Dash G. What about for development install?
dash capital D.
Dash capital D. So make sure you remember those things, okay? Going back to my notes. So we talked about the registry, we talked about the website. Awesome. Okay. So I already started talking about some of these popular packages. So there's a few I kind of want to call to your attention. So Nodemon, we've already gone and set up. So that's the way that we're going to run our programs going forward. .end, one of the things that we commonly find as we're building these servers is that we need to have some environment variables, some things that are controlled on the system side or controlled outside of our application. And we generally set those with environment variables. The catch is that environment variables are not very easy to necessarily configure project to project to project. So .env allows us to kind of set this environment using a file, which can be easier from a development perspective. Okay? So we will be using that in all of the projects. Debug gives us a way to write out the logs in a way that is more more categorized, stylized, more user-friendly. In fact, it allows us to do it in a way that we can turn all the logs off. So if we need our, in production, we need our server to be running really fast, I can turn all the debug logs off by just setting an environment variable. That's huge. If we're doing console.log directly is a synchronous action and can really slow down your server. So we don't want to use console log in any of our server applications. We want to use debug instead. Okay, so that's where that's going to fit in. Config is something we'll talk about next week. That's a way to set up configuration files for a variety of additional things. It gives us sort of a hierarchy of different configurations. I genuinely find myself using .env and config together, and again, we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so config is really important, and express is where we're starting here today, right? So we are going to start working with this express package. Okay, so if I want to start building a server with express, what do I need to do? Install it. Right, yeah. So we're going to npm install express. What you're saying, Evan?
Didn't he install it earlier and then uninstall it?
I think I installed config and then uninstalled it. So anyway, so I have express installed. Great. Didn't take too long. And now we can start kind of working with the code. Let's talk about the package.json here. So I've got a few things I need. So back to my notes. So there's a few different things you can set in here in the, and close that PowerShell window now. So in here you'll see there's the name, that's the name of the package. Generally speaking, as you saw, that will be the name of the folder. You've got the version number, you've got the description. The description is completely optional. The place where this description is used, looking at the NPM website, if I'm looking, say, for ESLint, which we were a minute ago, that right here, that sentence, is the description of the package, right? So you see the name of the package and the description of the package. So that's where that appears. It only appears on the NPM website. So it's something that we generally do want to set just for cleanliness, but isn't that important. Main.js just kind of tells you where the entry point is, as we talked about. That's important. We're going to set that to server.js for all of our things. Scripts, also an important thing to talk about. So let's look at that real quick. There's a scripts section here already. Everybody see that? So scripts gives us a way to kind of set up scripts that we can run repeatedly. We can have set up and we can reuse rather than having to type it in every time. So it already came in with a test script. If you have like unit tests that you need to run, that's what you would put in the test command. I'm going to ditch that because we're not doing unit tests right now, but I'm going to add two scripts in particular. So I'm going to add a start script, which is just going to look like this, node server.js. This is just here to say, hey, if you want to start the server, you want to have that command. It needs to be named, specifically named start. And when we go host these online, that's what Heroku is going to use to actually start the application, to start it in production. Okay, so you always need to have a start command, a start script in every Node Express website that you build has to have a start script. Cool. In addition to that, we usually add another script. So I'm going to call this one start-dev, colon, and this will be Nodemon server.js. So I will be using start in production and start dev in development. Okay. And so you'll notice the only difference there is one is running with Node, one is running with Nodemon. The way this figures in, save that file. If I now do npm run, npm run tells us to run a script. So I can say npm run start. And that would run the start script, right? So you can see there it just ran node server.js. So that's kind of like an alias for that. If I wanted to run the dev server now, I can say npm run start dev. So that's the important thing to understand. npm run will run those scripts that you set up.
Can you explain why we use some commands with the keyword npm and others with the keyword node?
It's a good question. So npm, remember, is the package manager. Node is the actual runtime. Okay. So the only thing that we're doing with the node command is telling it to run a script. That's it. So we say node, here's the name of the script. That's all we're using node for. npm is everything else, basically. All the management of the project, etc. Cool? Okay. So I'm going to kill that now that I've kind of set that up. So you can kind of understand how those scripts are set up, and this is basically what you're going to do for all your websites. Start is node server.js, start dev is Nodemon server.js. So that's some basic setup there. And we talked about the dependencies, we talked about the dev dependencies. Okay, so let's go on and talk about web applications. So I'm going to ditch everything I have here. Okay, and what I'm going to start by doing is this was in your reading on the Node section. This is not from your reading on the Express, because I didn't get a chance to kind of do an example with that, but I wanted to show you just how you can build a server with Node, not using Express. Okay, this is not something you don't need to code along with this part. I'm going to ask you to code along with the next part, but you don't need to necessarily code along with this part that I'm going to do right now, because I'm going to write it and then I'm going to erase it all. So first thing I want to do, if I want to build a server, a simple server with Node, here's kind of the basic hello world example. So I'm going to start with const http require HTTP. So I'm bringing in that HTTP module. HTTP module is built into Node itself. It's not a separate Node package. I don't have to go out to Node npm to get it. I'm just built in, kind of like readline was built in, right? So we used readline already, it was built in. So with this, I can create a very simple server, just writing a few lines of code. So next thing I need to do, so now I brought the package in, I'm going to say const server is equal to http dot create server. Okay. Now create server takes a callback function. That callback function is going to be called anytime the server receives a request. Anytime the server receives a request, it's going to call this function. And kind of think about it like if you clicked on a button or sort of things. But we're sending a request. So it takes two parameters, a request and a response. Okay, and then we determine what to do with it. I'm going to come back to this. The other thing we have to do, in addition to kind of setting up and telling what it does in response to every request, is we actually have to start it listening for connections. So the way I start it listening is I take that server object I created here, and I say server.listen, and I have to tell it what port do you want to listen on. So let's say I want to run the server on port 5000. I could say like this, and then I provide a callback function that is run when the server starts. So I might say here, console.log server started, or maybe server running, either way. So server running. So if I try to run this with Nodemon now, so npm run start dev, you can see that immediately when it starts up, it says the server is running. Everybody clear with me there? Okay. So now it's running and running on port 5000. So I can actually go to my browser, type in localhost, so localhost is the name of my own computer, and I say I want to go to a server or a service that's running on port 5000. So right now it'll just spin, won't do anything because I haven't told it what to do when I make a request. Everybody clear with me there? I made a request to it, but my code, I never actually finished the code up here to tell it what to do. So it just says, oh, I'm not going to do anything. So my browser is continually waiting for a response. It will never get one. It will eventually time out because it's like, well, you didn't respond. So I need to actually put some code in there to send the response back. So in here, REQ stands for the request, RES stands for the response. So I'm going to need to modify the response a little bit. So I'm going to say response.status code, status 200. Okay. Status code 200 says that this was successful. The status code says, was this successful or unsuccessful, or if it was unsuccessful, what went wrong? We'll talk more about status codes later. But basically, I start by setting the status codes. I'm also going to set a header in here. And this header, I'm going to specify what kind of data am I sending back? What's the MIME type of that data? And so the header I'm going to set is called specifically content-type. And the value of that header is text/plain. So I'm saying I want to send plain text back. That's what I'm going to be sending. I'm not sending back HTML. I'm not sending back JSON. I'm not sending back CSS. It's just plain text. Just treat it as a TXT file. Okay? And then finally, the next thing is I'm going to say res.write. Here's where I actually start writing the main part of the response. And I can say, okay, well, let's write in hello world, exclamation mark, ending in that. Okay, so that started to write that. And then I finally need to say, okay, now that I've written all the response stuff, let's end it. Say, okay, we're done. We've written the whole response. That's the end. So once the browser gets the whole thing, it can stop, it can stop loading. You can close the connection. So take that, refresh, there we go. So when I go to this page now, localhost 5000, it's responding to me with this hello world, right? Everybody clear so far? Does that kind of make sense? So like this is literally built into Node. You can just write servers this way. You can start and write servers using this alone. You don't necessarily need to add on a bunch of stuff, just so we're clear. It is possible to build servers this way. Some people do. I would not recommend doing this. Okay. I would not recommend following down this path and writing your servers strictly using Node. And we're not going to do that. Part of this is this makes it very
I can, all of the code basically to implement the server now is in that one function, right? This whole function is my entire program. And so I've got to put a lot of code in there. It's like, well, check is the path this. Is it a post request? Is it a get request? Is it requesting to this path or that path? And there's a lot of things that you can get into. And basically what you end up doing as that evolves, you end up building Express, right? Most people find if they go down this route, you're going to end up very close to the place where Express lands. Very similar sort of framework. Most people do. So that's kind of the starting point, right? You could write it this way. That's built in. What we're using with Express is built on top of this. All clear? Another thing I might mention real quickly here, before we leave the example, I have hard-coded this value as 5,000. Can everybody see that? Which is not great, because what if I give it to you and you're already running something on port 5,000? You have a problem, right? So you need to actually be able to configure which port this server runs on. Is everybody tracking with me there? So the way we do that is we move this from being a hard-coded variable to being an environment variable. So the way I read an environment variable in Node is like so. So I might say const port is process.env.uppercase port. So the process, this is basically the program that we're running in. env gets us to the current environment variables for that process, which typically these are pulled from the actual operating system in Windows or Mac or whatever operating system you're running, and then the actual name of the environment variable. Now, this name here does need to be port all uppercase. Reason being is because there's a bunch of servers, a bunch of services and things that presume the name of that environment was port. Okay. If you don't call it exactly this, you won't be able to run it off Heroku later. Okay. Now, if I just change my code like this, I say, hey, we're going to pull it from the port, and then we're going to use that port. All right. Now my server runs. Let's try to visit this web page. It's going to spin because I've actually never set the port. I asked for it from the environment variable, but the environment variable wasn't set. You see that? So if we write it like this, that only works as long as the environment variable is set. Okay. So I need to check in here. I need to have a fallback to say if a port isn't set, let's use a fallback. So I put in here, take it from the environment variable, or use 5,000 if it's not set. If the environment variable hasn't been set, we'll use the number 5,000 as the default port. Cool? So let's say I run that again. The server should now be running on port 5,000. I can refresh the server. I can see that that's working. Now, oftentimes you're going to find that you kind of want to know what port it's running on. So I might want to log that out. So I might change this to be something like server running on port blah. So now I know it's running on port 5,000. So if I'm able to configure it some other way, that number should change. So very clear there? Now, the way you do this in Windows, and I don't follow along with this because I'm going to actually do it differently. But one way you can do this in Windows is you type in env, go to environment variables. There's an option down here. And so there's two sections. So I can either set environment variables for my user, or I can set them machine-wide. This is how you would set these in Windows. Okay, is using this stuff. Everybody clear there? The user variables override anything that's in your system variables. If they're in both places, user takes precedence.
Can you show how you got that one going?
Yep. I can show you how you get here again. I don't want you to actually set anything, just so we're clear this semester, using this route. But I'm just showing you that you can. Okay. There's also ways to set this on the shell, but it's different depending on what shell you're using. So if you're using CMD, it's one syntax. If you're using PowerShell, it's a different. If you're using Git Bash, Bash is a different setup for setting environment variables. So just so we're clear, it's going to be different. And I think, Michael, your way of setting environment variables on the shell follows Bash. I think it's the same syntax as Bash, if I remember right, in Mac. So that's where we can set that. That turns out to, setting that machine-wide is kind of inconvenient. Part of that is oftentimes that requires you to completely reboot the system in order for that to take effect. So what I want to do is I want to actually use .env to change the port. Does that make sense? I'll use .env to change the port. So the way that .env works, I'm going to add a new file here, .env. Okay. .env allows me to set some of these environment variables just using this file. And so here I'm going to say port is equal to 6,000. Right? So if I set this, I want this to be running on port 6,000 instead. All clear so far? Yep.
No offense, but how is this any different than parse?
Because the .env file can be different on every different machine.
Well, yes.
So in fact, what I do is I go back into my Git Ignore. Remember we had that, and I ignore the env file.
And so if this was on another computer, another user's computer, and having ENV,
Yeah, they can have a different env than I have.
it'll go by theirs. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Exactly. So every developer can have a different env file because I'm not uploading it to Git. I can have mine as 5,000, you can have yours as 6,000. You need to change it throughout the day, right? And have a different decision.
Okay.
So the main benefit is that it's just easier to change than working with environment variables directly. So let's say I add this env file, right? You'll notice, for one, it's a .env file, so it doesn't trigger Nodemon to restart. Okay, let me go back to server.js and trigger it to restart. Still nothing, right? So one of the things to remember, anytime you're working with packages, there's usually more. Remember, there's usually more to installing a package than just running npm install. Okay, there's usually more setup steps. And so where could I find the rest of the instructions for .env? Where would I go?
NPM page for it.
Okay, so let's look at the npm page. And the npm page, npm.env, looks like so. What does it tell us we need to do? So we've done this part. We've got a file, .env file with some key and values. And the port is 6,000. See, under usage, we haven't done this. We didn't do this part. Require.env document. So I need to take that and put it at the top of my file so that this actually runs. So I'm going to go to the top of the file, and I'm going to say require .env, and we're going to say .config. So adding that in there now, you can see I'm now running on port 6,000 because now it's actually reading that up. Everybody see that? So in order for that to work, you have to start the code with this. There's another option that you can use, and I do this sometimes and find it sometimes more convenient. The other way you can bring .env is, if you kind of scroll down, there's another option that you can do. You see it says node-r.env.config. you can put that in your config. You can, if you start the server that way, then you don't need to put that one line in the beginning of your file. Does that make sense? This just says, hey, require .env config. Basically runs this before it actually runs your script. Now, let's say I was going to use this. Do I want to type that in every time? Do I want to type that in every time? If I want to type this in, -r.env config, what's my likelihood of fat fingering that? Probably pretty high, right? So what could I do? Thoughts?
File, and you just run the file all the time.
Run the file over again? So remember we have a package.json, right? So I set up two commands, node server.js, Nodemon server.js. So easiest thing for me to do would be just put it here, -r.env config. So if I toss that in here, this will always read the .env file without me needing to even put it in the code. So that's usually the safest way to use .env, is to just put it directly in here rather than putting it in your code. If you put it in both places, it will still work. It just reads the file twice. In which .env being as small as it is usually is a minor thing. Okay? So that's the alternative. You can do this, or you can put it at the top of your file. I usually would recommend doing it this way. Okay.
Now my question is, Mr. Smith, is how
Yep.
do we get to that same page on the local host without knowing the port?
Same page on localhost without knowing the ports?
I'm typing in 5,000 and now it's 516,000.
Well, here it says I changed my log to say it's 6,000. See, my log says it's 6,000. So I can just go now and type it in as localhost : 6,000. Which I must not have my server running. It says it can't be reached. Let me try to kill Nodemon and restart it.
Yeah, no, it's doing the same thing.
Could it be? Well, that's weird. Could it be that? Let's try 5001. Maybe there's something special about that port. So 5001. Okay, I just couldn't use 6,000. It's probably on my machine that something's probably using 6,000 already on my system. So that kind of makes sense. So that's another kind of important part, is we tend to use the environment variables to configure things like this, like the port. And there's a bunch of other things that you can configure that way. In fact, we'll do a lot of things this way, especially dealing with the database and other security mechanisms and such. Okay? All right. Let's, how's everybody doing? Is everybody good for a break, or should I keep going, take a break later? Yay or nay? Okay. Hands up for break now. Hands up for break later. Okay. All right. So let's keep going a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ditch everything in server.js now. Okay. So what I want to do, you kind of saw how I could do this writing it directly using Node. It's kind of a similar structure using Express. If you haven't yet, make sure that you have that .n file configured. So my .n file, I'm going to change it to say port 5000. And in the package.json, you'll see I have -r.n config. So make sure you have both of those two things. Make sure you do have your .n set up. Yep.
What's the .n?
So in the .n, I just have port equals 5000. That's the only thing that's in there. Cool. So port equals 5000, and here we have -r.n config. Okay. So going back to server.js, we're going to start kind of writing this out. So I'll write this with Express. So I'm going to bring in, instead of bringing in HTTP, I'm going to bring in Express. So const Express is equal to require Express. Okay, so we brought in that Express package, which we installed previously. So that's step one, is to import the dependencies that you need. Now I need to actually create an application. Okay, I'm going to put a little comment on there. And so I want to say const app is equal to express parentheses. So that's going to construct a express application, right? So first we bring it in, we import the package, and then we construct it. Okay, so that's your first two steps. Okay. Next step is, generally speaking, we're going to register some routes. I'm going to say, what do you want the server to do when the request is received? So on there, I'm going to take the application that I have, app.get, and I'm going to say get slash. Okay, so, and then this also takes a callback function there. This callback function takes 3 arguments: request, response, and next. And inside of there, kind of like I did with the previous server, I'm going to tell it what to do when it receives a request. So here I'm specifically telling it what to do when it receives a GET request to the root or the home page. So this is the home page with the method of GET. So you have basically the path or the URL of the home page or the root. And here's what I'm going to do here. So I have, again, the request object, I have the response object, and I have this next callback. Next callback's kind of unique to Express. We'll get to that later, but that has to do with middlewares. So we're going to say res.status. Okay. So I'm going to say the status of the response is 200. The type of the response is kind of like that content type header. This is what that's setting, is that content type header. The type is going to be text plain. And then I'm going to say, let's send a string back. So we're going to send hello world. So I'm saying, what's the status code that we want to send back? What's the content type that we want to send back? And then the actual content. It is important to do that in that order. You can't reorganize that and do send and status and type. Like, it has to be status type send because of how it goes through the pipeline. Okay, so that's basically registering a simple home page. Next thing I need to do is actually start listening for requests. So I've created the server, I've registered a route, I need to actually start listen for requests. Okay, and so here I need to know the port. So I'm going to say port is equal to process.env.port, and you can kind of see that's the same sort of setup that we had previously. And we're going to say, hey, I'm going to take the port from the environment variable, and if it's not there, let's use 5000. Now let's start listening for connections. So app.listen, listen for a port, and then I'm going to say, hey, when it comes back, let's go ahead and log that it started. So once it starts listening, we're going to do console.log. We're going to log this server running at, and oftentimes I find it useful to go ahead and put a URL here because I can quickly get to it from the console. So I might type in http:// localhost is the name of my server. So localhost : $port. So all of that's just to get it to look like this. Server running at localhost 5000. The nice thing about that, because now it's a URL, you can kind of see how it highlights in my console. I can hover over it and it'll say, okay, there. I can hold Control and click on it, and it will open it up in the browser like so. So there's a basic web server, right, using Express. Right, so you can kind of see the basic structure of that.
Any questions on the individual parts of the code? Does that basic foundation make sense of what I'm doing here? Yep. So we've already selected them. So hit Control and click on that URL. And it should open in the browser. Cool. You can toss that out. So you have your basics up, right? So this is the formula of things you have to have for an Express app. You have to bring in the package, you have to create the application, define your routes, and then do this part, okay? Now, basically all of the work we're doing is gonna fit into that area of setting up the application and registering the route. That's like our whole program. It's just gonna be extending that. Make sense? Okay. So let's say we want to add, maybe we want to add another page to that. Okay. So you can kind of see get. That's the method. We're making a get request. Here's the path. Let's say I want to make another page, and maybe we call this the contact page. Okay. So I'm going to make another route. We're going to call this contact. So we're going to get contact. It's going to say status code 200, text plain.
contact us. Save it. You'll see that when I'm saving it, it's automatically restarting my server, which is great. And so I can just go here and go into this and type in, so it's going to be localhost 5000 / contact. There's the contact us page. So I can get to these different routes pretty easily.
Yeah, mine's not restarting the server anymore.
Okay.
Maybe I'm missing something. I'm not sure what it is.
So Control C out of here. You run npm start. You know what start npm. Oh, shit. Go ahead and turn it back. Right.
Thank you.
So there's kind of our basic setup, right? And so hopefully you're seeing, right, the kind of comparison. Pull this back in. So here's kind of what it looked like without Express, right? Bring in the HTTP module, create a server, and then listen for requests. So it's the same sort of structure with Express. Bring in the module, create an application, define the routes, listen. It's just that this part of setting up the routes becomes a lot easier, is the main thing. Okay. So when we're talking about this, yeah. So this kind of this app get determines how we're responding to the request. So we're going to respond one way to /contact, one way to the home page, etc. I could also add in another route in here and maybe call this, maybe this will be post as the method instead. So if you post to the contact page, you can think about the contact page might have a form on it of some sort. If you were to post that form, it would go here. And I might send back something like sent. Now, there's a basic problem with being able to test that, because namely if I go to contact, if I type this into the URL, it's always going to be a GET request, right? So in order for me to actually have a post there, I would need to develop a form that then posts that route. Okay, so one of the things we need to talk about is how do I use Postman, which is a tool, kind of a client, sort of like a browser, to try out some of these other routes, right? So in order for me to try out that post route, basically I'm going to use Postman to do that. Make sense? So that's one thing we need to get to. So I've got a few theory things that I kind of need to cover before we get too far gone here. So the first one to kind of talk about is what we're building now, right? This application that we're building is referred to, definitely take note of this. This is referred to as a web server. We're building a web server, okay? And basically we're building a web server almost from scratch. We have all of the configuration here. We can build a web server any way and have it behave any way we want it to, which is actually very different from other technologies that have come before. Most of the previous technologies that we used before Node to build out web servers didn't give us this much control. Most of that was kind of hidden and like, okay, you're not trusted with that. But now we really, with the applications that we build today, we need access down to that low level. So it gives us really low level access. So when we're dealing with websites and web applications, we have two sides that you'll commonly see. We have the server, okay, which we're building in Node. And we've got the client, which talks to it, right? So the client is what in this case? So our application is the server. What is the client?
The browser.
It's the browser, right? So usually that's going to be the case. Your server over here is we're building that. This might be a browser. Other things that can also act as your client. So that might, other things that can act as your client can be things like apps. So this might be an app of some sort, or this might be some sort of other testing utility. Right? It could be a few different things, right? So, for instance, if we're talking about browsers, this could be Chrome, this could be Firefox, it could be Safari, it could be any of those. In terms of apps, this could be, your client could be a mobile app. It could be a desktop application. It could be an app that runs on your TV. Even today, it could actually be an app that runs on your car, right? There are actually cases where people have apps on the center dash, okay? It can be any of those things. Or it could be a testing utility, namely things like Postman, which we're going to cover. Fiddler is another tool that does kind of the same thing. Or it could be just something that somebody's hacked up in Python from a security standpoint. It could be a lot of things. Okay, the thing to understand is that the general definition of what makes a server, so we're talking about web server, this is anything that can receive requests. Anything that can receive HTTP requests is a server. Anything that can send requests is a client. So we start over here, we've got the client is usually running on one machine. It sends a request over to the server machine, server computer. That travels over the network and we get there. And then finally the server has to take that request and figure out how to send the response. Okay. So that's the whole communication mechanism that we're going to be dealing with this semester. Is we see requests from the browser or other clients, and we send a response back. Okay? That's the main communication mechanism. Is we take requests and we receive responses. Anything that takes an HTTP request is a server, or receives them. Whatever sends them is a client. Okay? So that's kind of defining what is a web server and what is a client. Other things that, these requests can be caused by a bunch of different things. Things that can cause a request includes, this may be a request for a resource or a file, like I may want to go to the home page, or the contact us page, or the about us page, or the product page, the shopping cart page, whatever. It may be just a thing I'm typing into the address bar or I'm following a link. All of those kind of things can trigger a request. Or maybe it's triggering a request to download your JavaScript file or your CSS file, right? All of that is a request to get a file. You can also see things anytime you make a submission to a form, that is also making a request to the server. Generally, it's going to be like a post request, might be a get request, could be anything. But that is a request as well. Another kinds of requests we see all the time are what we call Ajax requests, or asynchronous JavaScript requests. These are requests that we make out of band as the page is already loaded. Maybe we want to make a request to the server without reloading the page. So that's a really common thing. We can do that with the old HTTP API, or we can do that with the new Fetch API. But we see all those kind of things come in. So there's a lot of different things that can initiate requests, just so we're clear. Cool? Okay. So a few things to kind of talk about in this sense. and take note of this, and we'll come back to this, because I plan to talk about this later. So when we're sending that request, okay, the request and the response are made up of a few things. So the request that we send includes a method, say what method are you going to send it? That's usually get. That would be like get or post or put or patch or delete. There's a bunch of different methods that could be. We send a path, which says like what resource do I want to access? Do I want to access the main homepage with like slash, that would be root? Or I could say I want to access JS/main.js or CSS/main CSS. That would be the path to it. And the path can actually include a lot more to it as well. The next thing we send is headers. Headers is a way of sending a lot of metadata about the request, like what are we expecting to get back. So one of those we've already set is the content type that says, potentially you can say, well, what type of data do I want to get back? What content type would I accept? And then finally, you have the body of the request. Okay, so request has a method, it has a path, headers, and a body. Okay, body would be like if you submit a form as a post, then there's data inside of that body, which represents all the fields that you put there. Make sense? So that's what's in the request. In the response, we have a few pieces of data. If you're not writing these things down, make sure you do. In the response, we also have a status code. Okay. Status indicates is it successful or is it failed. You saw 200 is okay. There's a few other status codes we'll talk about as well. So that indicates was it successful or is it failed. There's also headers. Just like we can send headers in the request, we also have headers coming back. So it's kind of metadata about the response. So in particular, this would be where content type is. Where you say, hey, the content type is text plain or text HTML or application JSON. We say what the type of data we're sending back. So headers, and then you have the body of the response. Now, the body is the only thing that you'll see in your browser. If you're looking at your browser and you make a request, you type in something in the address bar, the only thing that appears in that main part of the page is the body. Your browser doesn't actually show you the headers or the status. Oftentimes they will affect your code, but you won't necessarily see anything besides the body. Cool? All this stuff is coming back and forth, but most of the time that's all you see. And all the user sees is this part of the whole system. So that's part of why we have to kind of explain this, because if you're just using websites, if you're just using a web browser and navigating the internet, all you've ever seen is this. In fact, that's all you saw in first semester, is that part. Okay? Questions so far? So we'll have to dive deeper into some of these pieces. You know, what does that mean and how do we send this data around? But that's how the data is sort of structured. That's the basic kind of categorization, the structure of these request and response types. Okay? All right. So that's the basics of what you need to understand about what's called the HTTP protocol. The HTTP protocol is we send requests, we get responses. So Express, we kind of built a example app already. We started working with that. Express, it's worth saying, gives us a few things, right? So we can build websites with Node. We can build websites with Express. Express has three components. There is a routing component, middleware, and views/templates, templateish. Okay. If you understand all of those three pieces, you understand all of Express effectively. Routing, middleware, and the view engine. Okay? So the routing is basically how we tell it where the request should go, what should happen, in response to a particular request. Namely, with the routing, we generally go off of the method and the path. We say, given the method and the path, do this, right? If the method and path is this, so like if it's a GET request for the home page, then do this thing, right? So routing is controlling that. Middleware then is also an important part. So a middleware, let me bring this definition up because I'll quote here because this is a kind of a common kind of stumbling point, especially getting into Express for most people, is kind of understanding what middleware is, because it's a fundamental piece to kind of have some understanding of what's going on, right? And so we're not going to start by writing too much middleware. We will start by using some middleware that's already built in, but as the semester goes on, we'll be adding more and more middleware to doing a broad variety of things. So, general definition. I'm going to read this quote off. Middleware literally means anything you put in the middle of one layer of the software and another layer of the software. So Express middleware or middleware functions are functions that execute during the life cycle of the request to the Express server. We kind of call that the request response cycle. We say, hey, we receive a request and then we need to send a response. We call that the request response cycle. So middleware runs in that cycle. Every middleware function that we have, that we've attached, has access to the request object and the response object as it goes through. It can access anything in the request, it can access anything in the response, including it can potentially change data in the request and can change data in the response. It's capable to change those objects, right? So it has full access, read and write. Additionally, the middleware can choose to terminate the HP request. You can say, okay, I've seen something here. I'm going to determine that I'm going to go ahead, send a response back, and close the connection. So for instance, if that route requires you to be logged in, a middleware can just say, oh, you're not logged in, you're done. Right? Or it can look at, typically we authenticate with something called a token. It can look at that token and say, oh, either the token's not there, you're done, or the token's invalid, you're done, you're not logged in, go back. So it can choose to shut down the connection right away. Another thing that happens commonly is we might want to prevent denial of service attacks. Limit how many requests can be made to our servers. So that we also have a middleware that limits that. It says, hey, you've made more than 100 requests in a second. We're going to go ahead and deny that request. Does that make sense? So we can do that as well with a middleware. If it's all good, and this is the more common case, generally our middlewares will go ahead and call the next function, and that will pass control over to the next middleware. So we kind of start building up these chains where you get into one middleware, does some processing, pass it on to the next one. That middleware does some processing, pass it on to the next one, does some processing, does it on the next one. Until we finally get to the function we would call our route handler, right, that actually generates that resource. So let's say you want to get to your home page, that route handler will finally generate the home page. Or whatever shopping cart page or whatever it may be, right? So we take the request that comes in, goes through a middleware, until finally we get a response. Okay? If at any point in there we decide to send a response, we send a response and we don't call next. Yeah, if that middleware is going to send a response, we don't run the next one generally speaking.
There be logic and if this,
Yeah, that's actually kind of the thing. It'll be if this, send, otherwise, next.
I was wondering why the rest of the send skipped over the other way.
Yeah, so they could go the other route. Okay, So that's the kind of thing to understand about middlewares. They're functions, and they're just kind of part of our pipeline, okay? And so they're going to do a lot of important things in our applications. So some examples of what they might do. We can use these middlewares to serve up static files. There's a function in there called express.static, which we can actually use to serve up a whole folder of static files. It's really, really helpful. We can use it for parsing the body of the request. That's the part that comes in here. Out of the box, Express doesn't actually do anything with this. All the data that's sent as part of the body is just ignored. And so request.body is normally undefined unless you put in a middleware. Okay, so we need to put in a middleware to parse the body that's sent. That's really common. So we can do that with request.url encoded, which will take care of generally take care of your form posts, or we can do express.json, which will take care of this body being sent as JSON. Okay, there's a bunch of other ones you can use as well, including there's one called Multer for handling file uploads, for instance. If you need to upload files, you can do that as well. We can also use that for handling errors, namely for handling like 404 errors and 500 errors. We'll be using it for authentication and authorization later. It's good for a lot of security mechanisms, as we've kind of touched on already. You can also implement compression that way. So you can hook up a middleware that will compress, gzip compress all the pieces of data, every response that you send back. We'll just automatically compress it for you, which is great. In fact, the name of that module is called compression, if you look at it on NPM. So that's really helpful. Next piece that we have in here is what's called the view engine. Okay, the view engine is used to dynamically generate HTML pages. So you take some data, you turn that into HTML using these view engines. Okay, that's the kind of goal of it. So normally we're going to send the response with, say, res.send would send back a response, or if I want to send back JSON data, I would say res.json, send back JSON data. But if I want to use this, I'm going to say like res.render. Okay, there's a lot of different view engines out there. There's a whole bunch of options in terms of view engines that you can use with Node. We don't have anywhere near enough time to talk about all of those. And honestly, a lot of those view engines are just not very good, suffice it to say. The one I've had the best luck with is one called Express Handlebars. And basically that allows me to put data into, I don't want to erase that all right yet. Headers. Body. That allows me to put data in, so I could say like username, with a little curly brace beginning there, and I could insert that into my HTML using something called a view. I'm not going to cover this right now. There's a little bit of reading you can read on Express about handlebars, Express handlebars. There's a few pages on it. I'm not going to cover that right now, simply because we're planning to later do React for our front end. And so if we're doing React on our front end, then we don't necessarily need to do handlebars to generate pages as well. So it can be helpful to do a little bit of both, but the way we're going to end up structuring it, we won't actually need a view engine. So we're not going to cover that at this point. Cool? Okay, so a helpful thing to know about, but we're not going to work with it right now because we would be replacing it later. Okay, so I do need to talk a little bit about these ones in particular. So serving static files, parsing the request body, and doing the error handling I need to talk a little bit about. before we go on to the next thing. So one thing to note here, sometimes, so far we set this up here that I've just set it up to send strings back, right? So it's very simple. It's just saying, hey, here, send this string in response. Oftentimes, I may want to serve actual files back to the client. So for instance, maybe I want to serve an actual home page, right? Kind of like we built home pages in first semester. You did some web design with HTML, right? So let's say I want to set up a server that actually delivers an HTML file. Well, the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call this public. Okay, so public is where we're going to put all of our static files. If you have any static files that you need for your website, always put that in public. Okay, public, we're just saying this is available to the public. Okay, so in terms of public.html, I'm going to create a new file called index.html. That name is important. So this is going to be our home page. So inside of public, I have an index.html file. Good so far? Does everybody have that? Okay. Does anybody remember what the key combination is to start an HTML file in VS Code?
It's the exclamation point tab.
Yep, it's the exclamation mark tab, and we'll get like that. Exclamation mark and tab will get you this. Okay? And so this should look familiar. Hopefully this looks familiar, right? So we've got the doc type, the HTML, the head, the body. All right, so maybe I'm going to call this, the title of the document is home page. And in here, maybe I'm going to add just a quick h1 tag. And this is going to be hello world. Huh?
No, I'm just complaining.
So there's my index.html, right? So I want to serve this up as the home page instead of serving up what I'd done previously, okay? So I'm going to ditch what I have here and just go back to this. And so in response to going to that slash, I'm going to change this to res.sendFile. So rather than sending a string, I'm going to say send a file. And so then I need to provide the name of that file or the path to that file. So I'm going to put that in as public / index.html. Okay. Now, if I don't specify the status code, the default status code is 200. Because I'm doing send file, it'll actually figure out by the file extension that it's an HTML file. So here I don't actually need to tell it the MIME type. I don't need to tell it the status code. It'll figure out both of those two things. So let's say we just do that. If I go back, let's try to go to the home page now. I've got an error. Okay, so I'm close there, but there's a little gotcha. Okay, so it says path must be an absolute or specify root to send file. So when I call send file can't actually take relative paths. It has to be an absolute path. So everybody with me there? It has to be an absolute path. So I'm just saying, hey, I want public / index.html. It says I don't know how to find that. I don't know where that is. Because I don't know what that's relative to. So what I have to do is I have to tell it where is it relative to. I have to give a path all the way back to the C drive so it knows where that file is. So everybody tracking with me there? So the way I do that, there's a global variable in Node. Several of these global variables start with --. So if I do --, you'll see a few options that appear. So there's like a dir name, there's a file name. So dir name, -- dir name is the one I want. Dir name is the path to the folder that we're in. So this is the path to the folder that contains server.js, right? The path to the script.
Came from .env.
Huh?
This came from .env.
No, it's not from .env.
Oh, from Node.
This is just from Node. This is just from Node. So --dir name is the folder that your script is in. Okay? So basically what I want to do is I want to like append that, and I want to say dir name plus public index.html. Okay. So I could do that. Let's see if that runs. Okay, that's not an error this time, right? So I do actually get hello world if I pull that up in the browser. No problem. This is, though, usually recommended against doing. Part of this is just because this may or may not work depending on what operating system you're on. So generally speaking, when we do need to say, here's part of the path comes from this, and part of the path comes from somewhere else, to make sure this works on every operating system, and we actually bring in another path, another package. So up at the top, I'm going to say const path is equal to require path. This is another one of those built-in modules in Node. And so this gives us a way to actually combine these two paths rather than using string concatenation. So in here, I'm going to say, now that I've got path pulled in, I'm going to say path dot, I think it's path dot join. Yeah, path dot join. So first argument to that will be the dir name, and the second will be my relative path. Now, in terms of the relative path, you want to make sure that doesn't start with a slash, because if it starts with a slash, you're basically communicating that you want to go back up to the root of the folder, back up to your C drive. So we're going to write it out like this. So you see path join, dir name, public / index.html. And so that's kind of the safe way anytime you need to refer to a file locally on your computer is going to be that pattern. Cool? Yep.
I noticed when you were using string concatenation that you did need to have that code.
Yes, you did, because otherwise it would be Hello World Express public. Yeah, so this is an important safety and security mechanism, compatibility mechanism. There's a bunch of reasons to do that. Make sure if you're doing concatenation, we're putting parts together, always use path.join, never use concatenation. Always use path.join, never use concatenation to bring these things together. Okay, so that's good. Let's say I want to have a contact page too. So maybe I add another route, and I want to say, hey, let's route this to contact.html. All right, so if you request, oh, I need to change this path. If you request just the root, we'll go to index.html. If you request /contact, we'll go to public contact.html. Okay. If I try to go there right now, it's going to error out because oh, I can't find a file by that name, right? Because there is no contact.html. Well, I can fix that really quickly. I can just say, hey, let's copy and paste. Oops, wrong file. Let's make a copy of index.html, and I'll call that contact.html. So I've got index.html and contact.html. And maybe I just change this. Contact us is going to be the title, and contact us is in the page. And so if I set that all up, it should look like this, right? If I go to that contact us page.
Oh, I should have been.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was looking at this and thinking that was your code. That's my code.
No, yeah.
So you're starting to see kind of the simplicity of kind of setting up servers this way.
This is great. A lot of well code against all that. This is great. This is great. Huh? So this is great. GR8.
Okay, so we can start setting up pages like that. If we wanted to serve HTML files, we can do that. We could also do the same thing and serve up CSS files and JavaScript files, right? What more than likely you will find as this goes on, you notice I'm kind of having to add a route for every single file, right? That may or may not be convenient if you have a whole lot of static files you need to serve up. Does that make sense? So one of the things I can do, and comment all that out, and then add in here, I'm going to say app.use. App.use is the method you're going to use to install middleware. So we're going to use app.use anytime we need to install middleware. I'm not specifying a path, so this is going to be installed for basically the whole website. I'm going to say express, or actually I want to say it's rooted at there, rooted at the root, and express.static. So static returns a middleware function, and so the path to this is just public. Thankfully, express static just takes a relative path, so I can actually provide it a relative path. So I'm going to say express static public, and this says serve up everything in the public folder as if it were kind of at the root of the website. So now everything in public is served up. So I can go out to the website and say, oh, let's look for the home page. I get hello world. If I try to go to /contact, you'll notice I get this error. Actually, it's a 404 error. I can't find it because, well, it's now serving it up as contact.html instead of just /contact. Cool?
So how does that really differ on the role?
It's a different thing in the address bar, suffice to say. I would generally prefer it to be /contact instead of /contact HTML. Part of that is just I can change what's happening in the background easier if it's this than if it's contact HTML. Make sense?
So you're saying do it this way in the website?
So I'm showing you both ways, right? It's usually a combination of both of these two, right? In fact, I can have both of these things in place. If I just go back to this, it will look and use this for the home page. And then if it's /contact, it'll use this. If it's anything else, then it'll fall down to this. So actually, if I do this, both /contact and /contact HTML work, because they both match to that one. Okay.
I don't get what that line 14 is doing.
Line 14. So app use says install a middleware function. It says, okay, from here on out, this middleware is installed. And so we say, okay, installed at the root. That's where the mounting location of this middleware is, which actually basically means it's installed everywhere. Express static, this gives us a middleware function which handles to say, hey, if there's a request, I'm going to go look in public, see if there's a file with that name, and if there's a file with that name, I'll serve it up.
So that's why you have to get it the full name. You have to take
I would say so. Like with doing that, like they can search or they can pull up anything that's within that folder as long as they have a full file name and the extension, right?
Yep. They can now get access to, with this, they can get access to literally any file that's in public. Part of the name of public, right? All of these files are public. The user can get to it, they just need the URL. So there's no real security around the files in public, if that makes sense. But that's generally okay with things like your homepage, your contact us page, your main CSS for your website, or your main JavaScript for your website, right? Good so far? Let's say I quickly just want to add some CSS to this. So maybe I go to public. Let's make a new folder. I'm going to call this CSS. Inside of there, I'll make a new file, call it main.css, and I'll just do some quick changes. Namely, I'll set the body to have a background of black, and I'll set the color of the text to white. Background black, color white. Going back into index.html now, I can do this in both the index and the contact us, these two pages. We'll say, hey, let's link that up. So link rel style sheet, if you remember from first semester, link rel style sheet, and then the href is slash css slash main.css. Now, when you're using some of these paths, you do have to be a little bit cautious because it will actually suggest you doing public slash css.main CSS. You have to know to skip the public folder because the public is actually being mounted as the root. Slash public is not part of the path. Okay, so it's not public CSS main CSS, it's just CSS main CSS. Okay. What am I missing? Oh, that's why. Okay, so I'm going to just bring that in, and I should be able to come to my home page. There we go. So I have some CSS in there now too. Making sense? So I can serve up all this stuff. Same thing like, well, you know, all the stuff that you did in first semester, basically you can toss that into public, and now you have, it's on a website, right? It's part of your application. So I can toss in Bootstrap, I can toss in forms, I can toss all my HTML stuff in there and work with it that way, right? And so I can add these additional forms if I want to specify a path. But you know, that will serve, that one line alone, line 14, will serve up everything that's in public without having to define a route for every single thing. Cool. Other things that we can do in here, which is generally pretty helpful, I can add some logging. So I can say console.log, and I could say, for instance, log homepage, and maybe contact us page. The benefit of doing that is then you've got some sort of logging to kind of start debugging what's going on. So when you get a request, like if I get a request to homepage, it'll log here. If I request the contact page, you'll log that as well. So all that's kind of helpful for figuring out what's going on, especially seeing the data that you may be receiving, right? Logging is very helpful for debugging purposes, okay? And this is going to be our main way of debugging. Our main way of debugging is they're going to be to log things out to the console, okay? All right. Let's take a break. We're definitely overdue for one. So let's go ahead and take a 20-minute break. We'll come back at 3:30.
Since it logged out the console and in Visual Studio Code, does that mean it's also in the browser as well?
It's not in the browser.
It's not in the browser.
It's not in the browser. If I log things from my server, it's just on the server side, it's not on the browser
I
side.
see. So in order for it to be in the browser, you have to link a JavaScript file to the index page and then do a console log in the native here.
Yes, because that would be JavaScript just running in the browser instead of JavaScript just running on the server. So you'll see the console log in the VS Code, but you won't see it here.
Yeah, it's all interesting. So can we still go to contact then?
Yeah, you still can type in /contact. Here's path.
This one chooses contact, and this one allows you to type in any of our
Other files. So there's noting here. So when you go notice on the screen. Okay, so if you type in /contact, that's going to be this, and you can see it up there. If you go to contact.html, see that's not going through this route.
Interesting, yeah, that's the way to see what's being launched, or what route's being taken. In we start pulling off our folders from previous assignments, so that, and just throw them into this hello world spread, and you can start serving them with it. With it first.
What did you say? Yeah, it's awesome. That's great. It's really like this flash, and you pay flash.
if we could start serving files,
Uh-huh.
one of the things came to mind was one of the ideas I thought to implement during our fellow project last semester, our first semester,
Mm-hmm.
but I never did, which was having a switch to toggle
Mm-hmm.
CSS files
Mm-hmm.
for that particular page.
Okay.
Can that do this, or is it not possible here?
It depends on how you want to set it up. There's actually a lot more nuance to that.
Like I can understand asking for it and sending it back, but how it gets
The question starts with how are you sending and storing the fact that you want like dark mode versus light mode, for instance, right? Where do you store that? So do you store that in like a cookie? Do you send that back as far as the back and forth as part of the URL? Are you storing that in some other storage mechanism? It depends on what storage mechanism you use to store that value
I see.
and how you want it to behave.
Is that where CSS variables would come into use?
No, actually not. Nope. CSS variables are great, but that's not per se one of those. At least not directly. You might use that. You could use a CSS variable as tool in a chain, but there's a bunch of more stuff you would have to have in place, and it probably wouldn't be the best tool for the job.
Okay.
Okay. So we were talking about middleware, and the middleware that we just kind of got. Actually, no, I take that back. My time is wrong. 3:30, not 3:20. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm like, I thought something's wrong. That was too short. How's everybody feeling though about the stuff we've covered so far? Is stuff starting to gel? Kind of fit together? There's a lot of kind of setup and build up.
I have a question, Mr. Smith.
Yeah.
What is this? What are these when somebody owns the URL but it's not actually anything, it's just wanting to buy it? What do they call it? Their name was. What do they call it? Is there a name for that? Yeah. Like it'll happen if you go to the wrong Netflix site, for example.
Yeah. It's basically, somebody doing their house right now, especially if they're helping social.
Invader?
Squatting.
Squatting?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
squatting.
squatting. This is a piece of squatting.
Oh,
They're squatting off of
what, oh, domain?
that's the name.
Private squatting.
Mhm.
Domain squatting. Thank you. Yeah, I'll keep in mind that term.
It's generally considered a filthy practice.
So that's a registered domain, right?
It's a registered domain, and
But
they're
it's being used to highlight the fact that it's owned by somebody else.
right. So what that means is somebody bought it, and they're paying yearly to have it, with the hopes that somebody will pay them more to buy it from them. Well, it's been around since the beginnings of the domain names and DNS. It's been
Parents that buy like their kids' domain.
Yeah.
Hoping that like they can sell it in the future.
yeah. There's tons of that. Yeah, there's tons of squatting.
Thank you.
All sorts of things. Okay. How'd that come up?
Somebody sent me a link, and I thought I was talking to a bot. You know, like you get their contacts,
Oh,
and they send you messages
Uh-huh.
that take you to links that are illegitimate.
yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was doing.
Oh, okay.
So, Mr. Smith,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of us around here kind of grew up in the 90s, thousands,
Mhm.
tens, I guess not tens, and maybe tens.
Mhm.
And, you know, we talk about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, right?
Uh-huh.
But we're going to be still alive in the next 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So what are we going to call it then? Is there going to be this awkward not knowing which one we're talking about when we get to that point?
That is a great question, and I suspect the answer is we'll probably just call it the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. We'll just know that we're talking about, 2050 and not 1950. Like, I mean, right now we just assume that you're talking about 1950, not 1850.
Indeed, yeah, not
I mean,
about 1850.
what happened in 1940 when they're talking about the 1800s? You know, 1940. If they said the 20s, well, obviously you meant did you mean the like 1920s? Did you mean the 1820s?
I remember reading about this in
Mm-hmm.
the documentation for,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the date document
Mm-hmm.
in Mongo actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it said something along the lines of that there's a calendar year and it starts halfway through a century.
Okay.
And that if you don't specify the first two numbers of that
Uh-huh.
millennium and then
Yeah.
ten,
Yeah.
then it just assumes it assumes it's at, depending on where you are in the 100-year span
Yeah.
it's working with, it assumes it's the latest one.
Yeah.
So like you put 10, it'll assume 2010 instead of 19.
Yeah.
And then I think it resets in the 40-year mark.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is you don't specify 2-digit years in code. You always say 4-digit years. Always 4 digits. It's never worth saving memory on those 2 digits. Okay. So that's 1, 2, 3. Okay. So far we've kind of set up the server that's serving static files, which is great, right? It's kind of getting us back up to where you were in first semester, right? We wrote static HTML and CSS and JavaScript files and you serve those up. So we can do that. We can throw those into public now and serve those files up just like we would anything else. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about in first semester is how do we start accepting, requests that are maybe a little bit more dynamic, right? So let's say you want to actually submit that contact form, right, and respond to it, right? So that's maybe where the next thing we should talk about a little bit. If we submit a contact form, how do we handle it on the back end? So I'm going to add a route in here, app.post. And so we're going to say when you post to /contact, then we want to do something. So I'm going to take the request, the response, and the next. In here, we're going to say, okay, maybe console.log, and maybe I logged sent. And I'm going to say res.type text plain, and I'm going to send the string sent back. Right, so if I get a post request to this, I'm just going to say, yeah, that's good, log something in console, and send a response back. Okay? So that's my route to begin with. Nothing terribly interesting, but that's where we're going to start. I'm now going to go back to my contact page. So pulling up my contact.html, and I'm going to lay out a basic form. So in there, I'm going to say here, I'm not using Bootstrap at this point. I'm just going to lay out a basic form for this. So I'm going to say, let's create a form tag, and the action, or sorry, the method is post. The action is going to post to the slash contact route, which we just defined. So it's a post to slash contact. I'm going to add an input field, and this is going to be, the name of this field is text, type is text, or maybe I just call this, maybe this is message, yeah. Input, the name is message, type is message, and I'm going to have a submit button, so I'm going to do button, type submit. This is going to be a really, really basic form, and that's okay. So let's say we set that up, and I pull it back up in the browser. So if I go to slash contact now, you should see that there's an input field and there's a submit button. Okay, so if I type something in, say my message, it's going to come back and respond with sent. All good, right? Also, it's worth noting, if I leave it blank, it's still going to respond with sent. So regardless of what I say, it's going to actually just log sent, right, and send that back. So I'd like to add a little bit more sophistication to this, right? So I'd like to kind of look at what the message is and do some validation, right? So maybe I say, okay, there's an error if you don't send a message, if you don't fill it in, or it's successful if you do give me a message, right? So first things first, I need to know what message did the user send to me. Okay, so let's start by just logging that out. So we're just going to say, hey, let's log that. So template string message. Let's just see, actually body is equal to request.body. And so just logging the body of the request to start with. Now, when I log the body of the request, you're going to notice that body is undefined. Everybody see that? Body is undefined. So out of the box, as I was saying earlier, out of the box, Express does not parse your body at all. Anything you submit with a form isn't parsed, right? So we need to fix that. Right, so there is a middleware, right? You saw there's a middleware to host static files, right? And we saw when we installed that middleware, the Express static, we installed that with app.use, okay? So remember, app.use is what we use to install a middleware function. I'm going to go up here and right under line 5, and I'm going to install some middleware up here, and this is going to be installed for the entire application. So for the entire application, I'm going to install some middleware. Namely, I'm going to say express.url encoded. I'm going to install that middleware. Okay. So if I install URL encoded up at the top, when I submit the form, you'll see that the body comes up as something different, right? Once I put in line 6, where I'm installing that URL encoded middleware, I actually do have something down here. Okay. Now the log's not very helpful, right? right? The log's not very helpful because it's just saying, hey, there's an object here, right? I'd like to see what the data is actually there. So one way I can do that is, if I remember right, if I just kind of pull this out, pass it like so. There we go. So if I just kind of log it separately, instead of using the template string, it will actually log it this way, right? So you can see that there's a message, there's an object, it has the name of the field as message, and the value is test. Cool. So I can see I'm getting some data through there. One of the things you'll notice as soon as I put in that line 6, do you see this body parser deprecated warning? Is everybody seeing that on their console?
Yep.
So there's this annoying error that they've kind of put in there. Basically means that you need to add something else to specify an option. And namely here it says undefined extended, please provide that option. So in here, in order to make that error go away, we have to specify extended. And this is a Boolean, so it can be true or false. I'm going to say extended false because I don't want to enable some of these extensions. So if I just change that, that warning will go away. And that's the only reason that we put that in there. It's basically just to tell it what should it be, and so that warning can go away. Okay? So we're going to put extended as false there. If I look at the request body, you can see that. And so basically the way I get down to the values that the user sent me is request.body. That is all the fields that the user sent me. So for right now, I'm just sending the message. I could also send things like what is their username. So for instance, I could go back to the here, add another input, and say the name is name, and or author, maybe I call it author. The type is hidden, so this is a hidden field, and the value of that field would be my name. So I'm going to say Paul Smith. So when the user submits this, there's an additional kind of hidden field in there, including your author name. So if I go back to the browser and I submit test, what we see here is that there's author Paul Smith, message test. You can see all that data there. Cool. So we can see we can send multiple pieces of data just using separate form fields. And you can see where that name, right, previously in first semester you would have been focused around the IDs. That name is what actually appears on the back end, right? So the ID you use on the front end, the name we use on the back end. Okay? So on the back end, we want to start processing that data. So let's say I want to get the author and the message. So I'm going to say const author is equal to request.body.author, and the message is kind of similarly, message is equal to request.body.message. So I can pull off the data that I'm receiving and then maybe log that stuff separately. So maybe I can say in here now, let's say, hey, let's log those pieces. So author is equal to author, log the author, and let's also maybe log the message. So I can kind of break some of these parts up if I needed to and deal with them separately. So if I repeat, continue, I'm going to see now I'm logging author Paul Smith, message test. Good so far, right? So that's how we can read anything that's submitted as a form. It's going to be from the body, right? If you have a form field, it's going to come through as request.body. It's worth noting this works this way with post. If you're reading data from a form that is a get request, it's a little bit different. Okay, so a get request is going to look a little bit different because we're going to pull it from some other place. Now, one thing I might want to quickly do is kind of change this up so that it sends a different response based on whether the message is blank or not, right? So I can put an if statement in there and say if blah. So if not message, right? If you don't provide me a message, then I'm going to say, hey, let's say res.status. Remember, status gives us a way of telling us if this was successful or not. I'm going to set this to status code 400. Status code indicates that there was a problem with the data that they sent us. So there's a client error. So I'm going to say status 400. Type again is text plain. And we're going to say send message required. So we're going to say message is required in that case, else. Now, notice as there is no return, right? If I didn't have this in an else, if I just had it this way, it would be running both of these. If I write it this way, it would say, okay, I'll send the message required, and then I'll also send sent, right? So I need to kind of be careful here about the flow of this, because send does not actually finish the function. So I want it to look like that. So now I should see different responses based on whether I leave it blank or not. So if I leave it blank, it's going to say message required. If I submit it with something there, it's going to say, yep, I got it. So you can start to see some of the back end work, right? I can get fields from the user, I can do whatever logic I need, and I can send whatever response back that makes sense. Cool. And say, hey, something's wrong, I can say, it's all good. Now, oftentimes we're going to have APIs like this that we need to be able to test without building forms, right? And in fact, that's the main thing that I want you to do in terms of working with the 302 lab. I don't want you to build forms for all of those different endpoints, all the different routes that you're going to run. You're just going to test them with this tool. Okay, so the tool that I want to introduce you to is something called Postman. Okay, so Postman is going to allow us to send clients, to send requests, send HTTP requests, just any way we want to. It's a lot more flexible than just using the browser directly. So you're going to look for on Google, you can just Google Postman downloads. It's going to take you to this page, download the app. So we want to download the desktop application, the desktop version of Postman. So if you would pull that up. Go back and just search for that's it. So pull that down, you're going to install it. I believe you can take all the default options for installing Postman. I don't think there's anything.
can be plugged in, definitely.
Oh, not like this. Absolutely terrible.
So for some big,
Yep, go ahead and update it.
Did you notice? Their logo for Postman is the orbit cycle for, I think it's Jupiter. Jupiter's 3 mins. So 1, 2, 4.
I think it's actually somebody with a jetpack on it. Last I remember.
Not the logo, but the loading, the initialization, whenever you
Oh,
look
okay.
what this one is. That right there.
Oh, okay. Got it. Yeah. So this is a really, really helpful tool. You can kind of think about it as like a browser on steroids. So we use this for testing. This is the way we're going to be able to test all of our routes in our servers and be able to see if things are working correctly before we have the front end built. So because what we're going to do is we're going to build all the back end first, and then we're going to build the front end later. In the real world, I would not recommend doing this. In the real world, I would recommend building the front end and the back end concurrently is always a better choice. But because of how things kind of slice out for learning purposes, it's a lot easier to just kind of spread things out and talk about it from front to back. Okay? Just so we're clear. So like if you're actually building this for a client, please don't necessarily follow the project that we're going to do this way. It's going to make it easier for teaching it and learning it, working from the back to the front. Okay? So this allows us to just send arbitrary HTTP requests. And close this tab and open a new one. So you may already have some tabs open, and you can close whatever tabs you have open. We're just going to start by creating a new request here. So I'm going to hit plus, right? And you can see it's an untitled request. Up at the top of this, there are 2 fields, right? So there's a drop down with a bunch of options. Anybody guess what this is? What is this?
Method.
It's the method of the request, right? So I can say, hey, I want to do whatever method I want. All right? So let's make a GET request. And then we can say, where do we want to make that request to? So for instance, let's make a request to our local host. So localhost 5000. And maybe we can just request the home page. Oh, there we go. So I hit send. It sent out the request, and it got back a response. So what you're seeing on the top is all the data about the request. The data on the bottom is the response. Okay. In here, you can see what came back. And first of all, it's showing us the code, right? So we can actually see the code of the HTML page that returns. If I wanted to get a better preview, I could go over to preview here. And now it's showing it and rendering it as an HTML page. Now, interesting things to note that it didn't actually render our CSS, right? So I've got a link to a CSS file here. It didn't actually go and grab that CSS file and use it, okay? But it didn't render it, okay? So I can preview the HTML that way if I need to, but more often than not, we'll either stick in raw Raw is going to give you directly just here's the text that came back, and pretty would be kind of a syntax highlighted version of that. We can see other things. So for instance, we can see the status code. So you can see this came back with a status code of 200 OK. It took 14 milliseconds for it to send the request and return the response. And the response was size 653 bytes. So I can tell some useful information right there. If I wanted to see the headers that it returned as far as the response are concerned, I can tab into headers. So I was in body, I can go over to headers. And so you can see it was powered by Express, accept ranges bytes, yada, yada, yada. Last modified, keep alive, content type. So here we're seeing that it was sent back as HTML with a character set of UTF-8. We can see that it was 337 characters long, right? So there's a lot of helpful data that we can see there. All clear? So let's say I want to make a request maybe to another page. So let's go to request the contact page. Okay. Same thing, just type it into the address bar at the top, and now we've made a request to the contact page. We can tell contact us, and there's our form. All good, right? So that's pretty helpful. Now, let's say I want to test the submission of that form. I can go over to post, hit send. Ooh, nice. Now, notice that that one came back as 400 bad request, right? Because that's what we said. If you don't provide a message, it's sending it back as a 400 code, right? So I can, in my code, I could maybe the client could handle that at some point. Could say, hey, if it's 200, it's successful. 400, it's not successful. So we're dealing with that here. And I can see the message required. If I look at the headers, you'll see the header here is coming back as text plain. It's not coming back as HTML. It says it's coming back as text plain. So that's what the type did, right? The type said that content type header. Okay, that's what that was about. So if I go to the top here, I can add in some data that we want to send. So for instance, maybe I want to go to body up here. So this is the body of the request that we're sending. And I'm going to pick form URL encoded. Okay. So I'm going to go to www form URL encoded. And let's say, hey, the author is Paul, and the message is hi. I'm going to hit send. We get back a different response. And if I were to look at this in VS Code, you would see there's the data that I just sent, right? So author Paul, message hi. So I can simulate a form post just like that, right? I don't have to write any code to submit a post request or a put request or a delete request, whatever kind of request I need to submit. I just write here. Good so far?
I've seen the back end and not having front.
Huh?
So we're testing the back end not having it front.
Exactly, exactly. That's the whole point of this, is to be able to test the back end without having to create the front end yet. Okay, because we're going to do the front end later. Right, well, the front end we're going to do towards the end of the semester. So we've got a bunch of stuff to kind of build up before we get there. Cool? So this is where we're going to spend most of our time. In fact, a lot of people, if you're working in the dev industry, this is where actually most people, this is a good amount of time where devs spend their time today is working with Postman. It's a really popular tool. Okay, other things I might try. Sometimes I want to, so this is sending it as form encoded, which right now we're handling. If I were to send it in a different format, so let's say I want to send it as JSON, which we typically do, I'm going to switch it over to raw, pick JSON here. So I'm going to send the same data, but I'm going to send it as JSON instead. And this is something to kind of that you're going to see, generally speaking, when we work with the front end, we're actually going to be sending as JSON usually, not as the form URL encoded. So in order to send that, we're going to say here author colon, and this would be Paul, comma, message. And if this data looks very similar to what we did with Mongo, then again, that should be the case. So let's say we're doing that. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. Okay. Now there's something kind of weird going on. So I sent this. Okay. Difference here is I sent this with the type of this being the type that I'm sending is not what we had previously. So if I look at the headers on the request, you'll see there's a content type of application JSON, right? There's a content type of application JSON. That comes from what I set up over here, okay? But if I look at what came in, you see it says author undefined and message undefined on the back end. So the problem is that this URL encoded, this middleware, is only capable of handling those form posts that we saw previously, right? So if we send it as JSON, it's in a different, the body is in a different format. So I need an additional middleware to handle JSON data. So we install one here, app.use express.json. So that's going to install this globally. So now if we get JSON data from anywhere, it's going to try and process it, try and parse it. So if we try that now, send, it should come through as sent, and you should see it come through this way with the data. Remove the process.
Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So often we have to have different middlewares and different. Okay, so that works. So we'll switch over to the post request. And so when we're on down, data move to the body. And get it pushed here. And then I'll just send it to this. So did that come through for you? Yeah. It looks like it's some. So oh, here. And then you set its text, and you see switch to this one. Yeah, let's keep going for a minute. Okay. So go back to
you have a space, so, it's, yeah, so go back to, try to send it again. Oh, you're not on the slash. Okay. But either way, this has to go back. That it needs to go on that either way. Put the slash mark back here. Because the dip in the section between is. Because you're showing it here, or you should be receiving it. So go back to the so it should say you receive. So you're missing what you're missing with the app up used, your own code response app up used. So you're missing line on 6 and 7. You got this back. This is how you're saying, okay? Using the code.
Okay. Because go back. Raw JSON. So this is sending it with header of application JSON. That is let's see. Let's restart the server. By the way, this shouldn't be how it's set. This should be local host. Right? So here we're going send we kind of look at your sectors here. So it says invalid email immediately.
Well, I want to do it anyways. Hey, bro. What you pack? What type of particle is that? Yes.
I'm not sure what's going on here. So I'm showing oh, here it is. You see, you're having spaces in there. You have to have those. So the spaces will make things. Try to remove them.
Nice. That's it.
All right. Anybody, you're still having issues?
So, we see that same component? Okay. So, this is the so, let's see that. We also make it out of use.
So we're kind of seeing the basics of, right, how to start sending data here, right? So with Postman, it's usually pretty simple there. You know, you set your what method you're going to go to. You set the path, right? So we've got those pieces. You can also set headers, and you can set the body, right? So we've kind of looked at all of that. You know, we haven't really mucked around too much with setting headers, but you can set them in. And you can't look at what's being set, okay? We'll get more into headers later on, right? The most important thing to check right now is just that your content type is being sent as application JSON if you're sending JSON data, or form encoded if it's form encoded, okay? That's the big thing to pay attention to, is what content type you're sending. Okay. Let's see. So we saw how to send a request, we saw how to view a request, status codes. Okay, so let's talk about status codes here. So I kind of briefly have talked about some of the status codes, right? So we've seen two of them, 200 for OK, 400, there's an error with the client, okay? So with status codes are always represented as numbers, and they have a lot of basically defined values of what those numbers mean. It's not just a thing where you can pick a number out of the blue and use it. Like, the numbers have a defined meaning. So they're classified into groups of 100. So you got 100 to 199, you have 200 to 299, etc. So you can tell from the first digit what kind of code it is. Okay, you can tell from the first digit what kind of code it is. So if it's 100 to 199, those 100 error codes are in what's called informational. We rarely use these. Usually these are used kind of by the tools that you're using, like Express may choose to send out some of these hundreds. We don't usually send those out from our code. Okay. Successful responses, that includes the 200. If things went good, then it's in that range. If it's a redirect where you're saying, okay, I got it, it's over here, or the page is moved, or whatever that may be, a redirect is a 300 level code. And anything that's an error with the client, right, on this side, on the request side, if it's an error with the client, then it's a 400 level code. If it's an error with the server, then it's a 500 level code. Make sense? 400 level code is a client error, 500 level code is a server error. Cool? So it's telling you which side of the equation, which side of the communication is the error on when there is an error. Okay, so let's look at what some of the codes are. I'm going to switch over the hundreds and go straight to 200. So 200 means it's successful. That's basically all you need. There are some other codes in here, 201, 202, etc. We won't be doing anything with those. So 200 is the only one you need to know from that category. Next up, looking at redirection. I'm going to come back there actually and talk about redirection last. So let's look at client. Okay. So 400, you can see here, is saying that you have given me an invalid request. Generally, we send that back anytime you maybe haven't sent a required field, or you sent something that otherwise is just an invalid value. Like maybe you sent a string of letters. Maybe you sent ABC instead of a number. Maybe you sent an email address that was invalid. But most of the times it's just cases where you haven't fit you haven't filled in the required fields. Okay? So 400 is that basic, like you haven't given me all the fields, or I wasn't able to read them. 401 is saying you don't have permission to view this resource. You don't have access permission, whether you're, mainly that means you're not logged in. You need to be logged in is what the 401 code says. If you send back a 401 code, the browser actually pops up a little username and password field for the user to type in their username and password. And they'll make another request with that username and password. So 401 says basically pop up a login box. Payment required is a new thing. You can kind of see anytime you see this little beaker, that means it's in experimental status where there's a suggestion that maybe add that code and do something with it, but it's not fully approved yet. So 403 forbidden. 403 forbidden says you're logged in, but you don't have the proper rights. You're not allowed to do this. Yes, you're logged in, but your user is not allowed. 404. This is probably one you've seen all the time. 404 not found. Says you can't find that file. This page does not exist. Right? So 404s are really, really common. 405 basically is a way of saying, well, you could have, it's like a 404, but it's not there because you're using a different method. Like you're trying to do a put, but I don't support put, I do support get. So you could, you can send that one back. We generally don't send 4 or 5, so not acceptable yet, yada. The main ones that happen in here, there's a whole lot of codes in here. But for the assignments right now, the two that we're going to be using is 400 and 404. Okay? So bad request or not found. Going down to 500, there's a bunch of different codes there too. The one that we'll be sending back is 500. 500 says there's something that went wrong on the server. That's it. 500 said something crashed. In general, 500 means there's an exception that occurred that you didn't handle. That's generally what it means. Is there's an exception that occurred and we did not handle it on our backend. Okay? The server crashed. We couldn't connect to the database. Something else went wrong. Okay? Usually these 500s come out as a result of database errors. Okay? So that's kind of your quick overview of some of the codes. There are a whole lot more codes to check there. And I definitely recommend doing some more reading, but you don't need to know all of the codes. Talking about the redirects. The redirects get kind of confusing because of the kind of the way that they're laid out and the way they're named. Because a lot of these are very, very similar. So like 301, it says moved permanently. So that means the main reason we use this one is if you've moved from one domain name to another. So if you have your website say my site and later you rename it to mysite.com and you rename it to mycoolsite.com, you would set up that first site to always do a 301 redirect to the other website. Everything that comes into that website, 301 redirects to the new site. 302.fat, it says that this is changed temporarily, but we don't usually use 302 for that. 302 we usually use the saying like, yes, I got your response, like the form you submitted is good, and now I want to redirect the user to another page after the form submitted successfully. So 302 we actually usually use in that case to redirect them. 304 is an interesting one. 304 says okay, we got your request, but we can see you already have that file, so just don't do anything. So 304 says, oh, well, you already like you request the home page, and then you request it again. Well, it says, oh, we send up to 304 the next time because you already have it. You don't need to download that HTML file, or you don't need to download that CSS file or that JavaScript file. This basically, if you use the express.static middleware, it'll already take care of doing the caching stuff with this 304. So we generally don't need to do too much of that. But you'll see that oftentimes come back when you're looking at the traffic. Okay? Or if you're looking at the browser tools in Chrome. And similarly, there's a 307, and there's a little bit of nuance between that 307 and the 302. Both of those are a temporary redirect. So I don't want to go into necessarily all the nuances there, but basically it has to do with, you repeat it with, I think 307, you repeat it with a post. If it was a post, you redirect and do a post again, versus 302, you redirect and then do a get. We basically just use 302 instead of using 307. There's very, very, very few cases that you ever want to use a 307. Same way with 308. Cool? So most redirects end up being either a 301 or a 302. Most of the redirects that we do in code are 302s. Status codes. So those are kind of the overview for the status codes. Does that kind of make sense for everybody? Right, so one important one on there, what you use when the page is not found, what status code is that?
404.
It's a 404, right? If there's an internal server, that is a 500. And if the user doesn't fill in, say, a required field, 400. Cool. So those are important numbers to remember. Going back to my notes. So oftentimes we'll kind of get to this point. We got a request that's good, and we may want to save it for later. You'll see that there's kind of this red circle on there. Indicates that we have an unsaved request. So I may want to go up to the top right and hit this little save button. It says save request to a collection, and hit save. Now, in order to actually save it, I have to put it into a collection. So a collection is a collection of requests. It's kind of a way to group things together, right? So maybe we're going to call this the Hello World collection. So I'm going to say new collection here. Call that new collection Hello World. Okay. You can either leave the request the same way as it is, or I might change it to a different name. So I might change the name of this request to contact page and put it in the Hello World category. Hello World collection. So Hello World collection, contact page. Okay. So if I save that little thing's going to go away, and over here on the right, under my collections, you can now see that it is under that category. Cool. So that'll let you kind of save things for later. So as you start working through the issue tracker, you can start saving some requests and being able to repeat them and not have to recreate them every time. Cool?
So now that they're grouped, can you run them all at once? Or is that not under someone?
I think you can. I haven't done too much with that myself, to be honest.
Okay.
I usually am just running one by one.
Okay, but it helps you find them.
But it does help you organize them and save them. So that's one thing I would recommend. It's also possible in here to have variables. So you can define variables in the page. I will kind of point you at some documentation here. So there is a page you can read about using variables if you do want to get into that. And I'll link that in Discord. But that's enough to get you guys started in terms of Postman. Okay. Just a few words on that. We talked about the status codes. Just a few words on the methods. So here, in terms of the drop down, you've got a few different methods you can use. Okay, so get, make a note of this. So get is a way of requesting data. It's saying I want to read data. The important thing about get is it should never modify data. Get should never modify data. The assumption is that like it's just reading data and new data is being changed. Okay. Post is a way I want to send data to the server, and post you can basically be anything. Post can be any sort of submission. There's no other constraints about it. It's like usually the server's doing something. One of the things to know about post is that it can't be cached. All the caches along the way can't cache post. The only thing that can be cached is get. Next up, we've got put. Okay, put is basically I'm saying here is I'm going to upload or change an existing resource in there. So I'm going to replace it with something new. So that's what put is meant to be. It's meant for CRUD semantics, namely if you're creating a page or you're updating a page, you can think of it if I'm like creating a bug or updating a bug, then that would be a put. So that's create or update. Patch is specifically designed as a update. Patch, the idea is I'm updating just part of the file. So if I'm saying I'm going to update part of this page or part of that resource, then that usually is considered a patch. And then the delete is saying I want to delete that resource. I want to delete what's there. So that's kind of the semantics of those. There are other ones up there. You can see that the list is a lot longer. That's all we're going to talk about this semester is get, post, put, patch, and delete. Okay, and the main ones I'm going to focus on are like get, put, and delete. Okay, with post thrown in there every once in a while. Okay, so that's kind of where that fits in. That's kind of the semantics of those verbs. Basically, for the most part, so post, put, and patch, those three you can send data as part of the body of the request. Typically with get and delete, we do not send data as part of the body. We'd only send data as part of the URL or headers. Okay, so generally get and delete do not have a body in the request. Okay, so where we're sitting at, that basically kind of gets you started with kind of some understanding of where we're going. Tomorrow, I've got a little bit more to this, so I want to go actually through. Tomorrow, my plan is to go through an example of kind of making an API. So particularly kind of making a little bit of an API building. So we'll do like that tomorrow. And that'll help you get started with the labs.
I know, that's not important. I got tired of